Welcome to this quiet, safe space where nothing is required of you except to rest. You're here and you're safe. Everything else can wait. Let go of your thoughts, your tasks, your worries. There's nothing to solve, nothing to do. Just listen. Take a slow breath and another. Settle in, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift. Now let the story begin. This is a story about the daily life of a farmer named Samuel Thompson who lived in rural Ohio during the year 1847. Samuel was not a remarkable man, nor did anything extraordinary happen to him. He woke up each morning at the same time, performed the same tasks, and went to bed at the same hour every single day. His life was predictable, quiet, and utterly unremarkable in every way. This story simply follows Samuel through one complete year of his life, from early spring through the following winter. We will follow him not because anything exciting happens, but because understanding how he spent his time will help us understand what it meant to be a farmer in 19th century America. And perhaps, as you listen, the steady rhythm of his days will help your own mind slow down. Your breathing deepen, your body relax, because there is nothing here to surprise you, nothing to startle you awake. Only the gentle, predictable turning of the seasons, and one man walking his fields, day after day, in the quiet countryside of Ohio. Samuel's farm was located approximately 8 miles outside of a small town called Millbrook. 8 miles was not a great distance, not by modern standards, but in 1847, 8 miles meant a journey of nearly an hour by horse, and longer if the roads were muddy, and the roads were often muddy. The town of Millbrook itself was very small. Perhaps 300 people lived there, perhaps 350. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a church with a white steeple, a mill where farmers could grind their grain into flour, a post office, and perhaps a dozen houses clustered around the main road. Beyond that, there were only farms, hundreds of farms, stretching in every direction across the gently rolling hills of southern Ohio. Samuel's farm was one of those, not the largest, not the smallest, just a farm. 120 acres of land, which was considered a modest holding for the time. Some of his neighbors had 200 acres, some had only 40, but 120 was respectable. It was enough to feed his family, enough to produce a small surplus to sell or trade, enough to pay his taxes, enough. Samuel lived there with his wife Martha. Martha was 42 years old. She had been a pretty woman once, or so Samuel remembered, but now her face was lined from years of sun and wind and the heat of the cook stove. Her hands were rough from endless work, but her eyes were kind and her voice was soft. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words were gentle and measured. They had been married for 20 years, and she had given him 3 children who survived infancy. There had been others, 2 babies who did not live past their first winter. Samuel did not speak of them. Martha did not speak of them either, but sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Samuel would see Martha staring at nothing, and he knew she was thinking of those small graves in the churchyard. But life continued. It always continued. Their oldest child was William, who was 17 years old, tall for his age, taller than Samuel now, with broad shoulders and large hands. He worked alongside his father every day. He did not complain. He did not dream of leaving the farm, or at least he never said so. William was quiet like his mother, and he would become a farmer. Samuel was certain of this. There was no other path for him. Then there was Elizabeth, who was 13. She helped her mother with the household work. She could cook, she could sew, she could tend the garden, she could preserve vegetables in jars, She could churn butter. She could spin wool into thread. She could do all the things a woman needed to do to keep a household running. In a few years, she would marry, probably a farmer's son, probably someone from the church or from a neighboring farm, and she would move to his farm and begin the same life her mother had lived. And then there was Thomas, young Thomas, who was only 6 years old. He was too young to do real work, though he tried to help. He carried small things. He fetched water from the well, though the bucket was too heavy for him, and he usually spilled half of it before he reached the house. He followed his father through the fields asking questions. "Why is the sky blue, Papa? Why do the chickens lay eggs? Where does the sun go at night?" Samuel answered when he could, but often he simply said nothing, and Thomas eventually grew quiet. Samuel did not speak of them. Martha did not speak of them either, but sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Samuel would see Martha staring at nothing, and he knew she was thinking of those small graves in the churchyard. But life continued. It always continued. Their oldest child was William, who was 17 years old, tall for his age, taller than Samuel now, with broad shoulders and large hands. He worked alongside his father every day. He did not complain. He did not dream of leaving the farm, or at least he never said so. William was quiet like his mother, and he would become a farmer. Samuel was certain of this. There was no other path for him. Then there was Elizabeth, who was 13. She helped her mother with the household work. She could cook. She could sew. She could tend the garden. She could preserve vegetables in jars. She could churn butter. She could spin wool into thread. She could do all the things a woman needed to do to keep a household running. In a few years, she would marry, probably a farmer's son, probably someone from the church or from a neighboring farm, and she would move to his farm and begin the same life her mother had lived. And then there was Thomas, young Thomas, who was only 6 years old. He was too young to do real work, though he tried to help. He carried small things. He fetched water from the well, though the bucket was too heavy for him, and he usually spilled half of it before he reached the house. He followed his father through the fields asking questions. "Why is the sky blue, Papa? Why do the chickens lay eggs? Where does the sun go at night?" Samuel answered when he could, but often he simply said nothing, and Thomas eventually grew quiet. The boy would learn that the sky was blue because it was blue, that chickens laid eggs because that was what chickens did, that the sun went down and came back up again, and that was all anyone needed to know. He would learn. Let me describe the farmhouse to you, because you will spend a great deal of time here, as Samuel did, and as Martha did, and as the children did. The farmhouse was made of wood, wooden beams, wooden planks, wooden shingles on the roof. The outside had been painted white once, many years ago, but now the paint was peeling in places, especially on the side of the house that faced the weather, where the wind and rain had stripped the white away until the gray would showed through underneath. It was not an ugly house, it was simply an old house, a practical house, a house built for shelter, not for beauty. The house had 3 rooms downstairs. The first room you entered was the kitchen, and this was the largest room in the house, though large was a relative term. It measured perhaps 15 feet by 15 feet. In the center of the room stood a large black iron stove, and this stove was the heart of the house. It was used for cooking, for boiling water, for heating the house in winter. It was made of cast iron, heavy and dark, with a flat top where pots and pans could sit, a firebox on one side where wood was burned, and a flue that carried smoke up through the roof. The stove was always warm, even in summer when the house was already hot. The stove was warm. Martha spent most of her waking hours near the stove, standing, bending, lifting pots, stirring, wiping, cleaning. Around the stove, hanging from hooks on the wall, were various pots and pans, iron pots for boiling, iron skillets for frying, a large copper kettle for heating water, a cast iron Dutch oven with a tight-fitting lid. All of them blackened from years of use, all of them hanging in neat rows within easy reach. On shelves along the walls were jars and containers, glass jars filled with dried herbs, clay crocks filled with salt pork or pickled vegetables, tins filled with flour and cornmeal and sugar. A large wooden bin near the door held potatoes, another held turnips. The floor of the kitchen was made of wide wooden planks that had darkened over time, stained by years of spilled water and dropped food and muddy boots. There was a rug near the stove, a small braided rug made from scraps of old cloth that Martha had made herself one winter, sitting by the fire, her fingers moving slowly, braiding the strips of cloth together. The windows in the kitchen faced south toward the fields. There were 2 windows, each had 4 panes of glass, and the glass was not perfectly clear. It had waves and bubbles in it, distortions from the old method of glassmaking. So when you looked through these windows, the world outside appeared slightly wavy, slightly blurred, as if you were seeing it through water. The window frames were wooden, painted white like the outside of the house. The paint was chipping there too, and when the wind blew, the window panes rattled gently in their frames. Rattle, 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 a soft rhythmic sound that Samuel had heard so many times he no longer noticed it. The second room downstairs was the sitting room, which was smaller than the kitchen, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet. It contained a fireplace, though the fireplace was used less often now that the stove provided most of the heat. The walls of this room were painted a pale cream color, but near the ceiling the cream darkened slightly from years of cooking smoke. Even with the stove's flue, some smoke always escaped into the house, rising toward the ceiling slowly, invisibly, and over time leaving a faint stain on the walls and on the ceiling beams. The furniture in this room was simple. There was a wooden table made from oak. Oak was strong, oak was heavy, and this table had been built by Samuel's father 40 years ago, using oak trees cut from this very farm. The table was long enough to seat 6 people, and there were 6 chairs surrounding it. 3 of the chairs had woven seats made from strips of hickory bark woven together in a pattern and then dried until they were hard and smooth, and the other 3 chairs had solid wooden seats that were less comfortable but sturdy. There was also a wooden cupboard against one wall where Martha kept plates and bowls and cups, most of them made of earthenware glazed in brown or yellow, some cracked, some chipped, but they held food and that was all that mattered. The third room downstairs was a small storage room, not really a room at all but more of a closet, a narrow space beneath the stairs that led to the second floor. Here, Martha kept brooms and mops and buckets. She kept candles and lamp oil. She kept extra cloth for mending clothes. She kept dried apples hanging from strings. It was a dark space with no window, and the door was usually kept closed. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. One was Samuel and Martha's room, and the other was the children's room. These rooms were very small, each had just enough space for a bed and a small chest for clothing, and the ceilings were low, sloping down where the roof came close to the floor, so you had to be careful walking near the edges of the room or you would hit your head. The beds were made of wood with ropes strung across the frame to support the mattress, and the mattresses were stuffed with straw from the previous year's harvest. Every spring, the old straw was removed and burned, and the mattresses were refilled with fresh straw that smelled sweet and clean. But after a few months, the straw began to smell like sleep, like sweat, like the bodies that lay upon it night after night. The windows in the bedrooms faced east and west, so in the morning sunlight came through the east window falling across Samuel's face, waking him gently, and in the evening the last light of day came through the west window, painting the room gold and orange before fading to gray. Behind the house, perhaps 50 feet away, stood the barn. The barn was larger than the house, much larger. It measured 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, and it had a peaked roof covered in wooden shingles just like the house. The barn was painted red, not because red was beautiful but because red paint was cheap, made from iron oxide, which was basically rust, and rust was plentiful. Mix rust with linseed oil and you had paint, cheap paint, good enough for a barn. The barn had 2 large doors on the south side facing the house, wide enough for a wagon to pass through, made of vertical wooden planks held together with iron straps. The wood had weathered to a silvery gray except where the red paint still clung in patches. The doors opened outward, and when they were open you could see into the main area of the barn, which was called the threshing floor. This was a large open space with a dirt floor, and the dirt had been packed hard over the years, compressed by the weight of animals and wagons and men until it was almost as solid as stone. This is where the wheat was threshed, where the hay was sorted, where animals were brought for medical treatment, where wagons were repaired. On the left side of the threshing floor were the animal stalls for horses and oxen. Samuel had 2 oxen and 1 horse. The oxen were named Buck and Star, large, slow-moving animals with wide horns and gentle eyes. Not smart but strong and patient, able to pull a plow through heavy soil all day without stopping. The horse was named Jack, smaller than the oxen but faster, used for traveling to town, for pulling the wagon when speed mattered, for riding when Samuel needed to cover ground quickly. Jack was a brown horse with a black mane and tail, not young, perhaps 15 years old, which was old for a horse, but he was healthy and calm and did not startle easily, and these were good qualities in a horse. On the right side of the threshing floor were the hayloft and the grain storage area. The hayloft was above the animal stalls, accessible by a wooden ladder, a large open space filled with hay, dried hay, sweet-smelling hay, stacked in bales or sometimes in loose piles, filling the loft from floor to ceiling. In the winter, when the barn doors were closed and the animals were inside, the barn was warm, the heat from the animals rising into the hayloft and the hay holding that heat, the whole building feeling almost cozy. The grain storage area was on the ground floor near the back of the barn, where Samuel kept bags of wheat, corn, and oats. The bags made of heavy cloth stacked on wooden pallets to keep them off the dirt floor, each bag holding approximately 2 bushels of grain. A bushel of wheat weighed about 60 pounds, a bushel of corn weighed about 56 pounds, a bushel of oats weighed about 32 pounds. These were important numbers to Samuel, determining how much food he had, how much he could sell, how much he could trade, determining whether his family would eat well through the winter or barely survive. Behind the barn, perhaps another 50 feet, stood the chicken coop, a small wooden structure perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a slanted roof covered in wooden shingles and a small door that Martha could crawl through to collect eggs. There was a window on the south side covered with wire mesh to keep predators out while letting air in. Inside the coop were roosting bars where the chickens slept at night, simply wooden poles about 2 inches in diameter mounted horizontally about 3 feet off the ground. The chickens hopping up onto these poles at dusk, settling in for the night, their feathers fluffed up against the cold. There were nesting boxes along one wall, small wooden compartments each about a foot square filled with straw, where the hens would lay their eggs, 1 egg per day most days from each hen. Samuel had approximately 20 hens and 1 rooster named Red because his feathers were a deep reddish-brown. Red was loud, beginning to crow before dawn, sometimes as early as 4 in the morning and continuing throughout the day. Cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo, a sound Samuel had heard so many times that he no longer woke to it. his body having learned to sleep through the rooster's crowing just as it had learned to wake at the first gray light of dawn. Near the chicken coop was the pig pen, a fenced area perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet with a simple wooden shelter in one corner. The fence was made of split rails, long wooden logs split lengthwise into halves or quarters, stacked horizontally between wooden posts, creating a barrier that pigs could not push through because pigs were strong and determined. And if a fence was weak, a pig would find the weakness and push against it again and again until something gave way. So Samuel built his pig fences strong and checked them regularly and repaired them immediately when he found damage. Inside the pen lived 3 pigs, 2 sows and 1 boar, the sows named Bess and Molly, the boar named Boris. Boris was very large, perhaps 400 pounds, with small eyes and a large snout and tusks that curved up from his lower jaw. He was not friendly, but he did not need to be friendly. He needed to breed with the sows, and he did that well. And the sows would give birth to litters of piglets each spring and fall. Some of the piglets raised to adulthood, some slaughtered for meat, some sold to neighboring farms. This was the cycle of pig life on Samuel's farm: birth, growth, slaughter, meat, and then birth again. Behind the house, on the side that faced away from the barn, was the vegetable garden, measuring approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, 1,200 square feet of growing space organized into neat rows each about 3 feet apart, the rows running north to south so that the sun would travel across them during the day, hitting both sides of each plant. The garden was surrounded by a wooden fence similar to the pig pen fence but shorter, only about 3 feet tall, meant not to keep out large animals but to keep out chickens and rabbits and other small creatures that would eat the vegetables. Martha was the gardener. Samuel helped when she asked him to, but the garden was her domain. She decided what to plant and where to plant it and when to plant it and how much to plant. She knew which vegetables grew well together and which did not, which soil was best for potatoes and which was best for beans, when to water and when to let the plants dry, when to harvest and when to wait. The garden was Martha's work, and she took pride in it. In the spring, the garden was brown earth and tiny green shoots. In the summer, a riot of green leaves and colorful vegetables. In the fall, heavy with ripening produce. In the winter, empty and brown again, waiting for spring. 50 feet from the house, between the house and the barn, stood the well. The well was a hole in the ground lined with stone to prevent collapse. Very deep, 30 feet deep, dug by Samuel himself 15 years ago, working through clay and rock until he reached water. Above the well he had built a simple wooden structure, 2 vertical posts each about 6 feet tall with a horizontal beam connecting them at the top. A rope attached to this beam running down into the well, and at the end of the rope a wooden bucket bound with iron bands large enough to hold perhaps 2 gallons of water. To get water, Samuel would lower the bucket into the well using the rope, let it fall until he heard a splash, wait a moment for the bucket to fill, then pull the rope hand over hand, lifting the bucket back up to the surface. The water was cold. Even in summer when the air was hot and the sun was beating down, the well water was cold, coming from deep underground where the temperature remained constant year-round, tasting slightly of minerals, slightly of earth, but clean and safe, and the only water the family had. The farm was divided into sections by wooden split-rail fencing: the fields, the pasture, the barnyard, the garden, each section with its own fence, its own purpose, its own rules. The fences were not beautiful. They were functional, split rails stacked between wooden posts creating a barrier that animals could not cross. The rails made from young trees, usually oak or hickory, cut to length and split with a wedge and a mallet. Splitting a log was hard work, placing the wedge on the end of the log, striking it with the mallet, watching as the log split along its natural grain, sometimes cleanly, sometimes not, and when it did not you tried again and again and again until eventually the log would split because it had a grain and the grain would guide the split if you were patient. The fences required constant maintenance. rails rotting, posts leaning, animals pushing against weak spots. So every spring and every fall Samuel walked the entire perimeter of his farm, inspecting every section of fence, carrying a hammer and a bag of nails and extra rails on a cart. When he found a broken section he stopped, removed the old broken rail, measured a new rail against the gap, cut the new rail to length using a handsaw, positioned the new rail between the posts, nailed it in place, and then continued walking one fence post at a time, one rail at a time, one section at a time. It was tedious work, but it was necessary. Without fences the animals would wander, the crops would be eaten, the farm would fail, so Samuel maintained his fences day after day, year after year. Before we follow Samuel through the seasons, let me describe his daily rhythm. He woke before dawn every day, winter and summer, rain or shine, waking in the dark when the sky was still black and the stars were still visible through the bedroom window. He lay in bed for a moment listening to the silence, listening to Martha breathing beside him, listening to the wind against the window glass. Then he rose, dressing in the dark, pulling on his wool trousers and his cotton shirt and his leather boots, not lighting a candle because he did not need one. He knew where his clothes were. He knew how to button his shirt in the dark. He knew how to tie his boots without looking. He walked downstairs, his feet finding the steps automatically even in the darkness. And in the kitchen he lit a candle from the embers of last night's fire. The embers were still warm, still glowing red beneath the ash, and he blew on them gently and they glowed brighter, and he added small sticks of kindling and blew again, a flame appearing small at first then larger. Then he added larger pieces of wood until the fire was burning and the kitchen began to warm. This was Samuel's morning ritual every day, the same motions, the same actions, the same result, and he did not think about it. He simply did it, his body knowing what to do, his hands moving without instruction. By the time the sun rose, Samuel had been awake for an hour, the animals had been fed, the fire was burning, the coffee was boiling on the stove, and Samuel was ready to begin another day of work, another day of walking the fields, another day of repairing fences, another day of weeding and planting and harvesting and storing, another day, and then another, and then another. Spring. March, early spring preparation, assessment and planning. The month of March arrived slowly on Samuel Thompson's farm. The snow had begun to melt during the final weeks of February, and now, in early March, only patches of white remained in the shade of the barn and along the northern edge of the woodlet. The ground was still partially frozen. When Samuel walked across his fields on the first morning of March, he could feel the hardness beneath his boots. The soil was not yet ready for planting, but it would be soon. The sun was warmer now than it had been a month ago. It rose earlier each day, set later each evening. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible, but Samuel noticed it. He always noticed it. After years of farming, his body had learned to feel the turning of the seasons before his mind registered it. He woke earlier in spring. He felt more energy in his limbs. He looked forward to the day's work in a way he never did during the gray, cold months of winter. On this particular morning, Samuel walked through his fields for nearly 3 hours. He started at the eastern edge of his property, where the land was flattest and the soil was deepest. This was his best field. He planted his wheat here year after year, because wheat required good soil. He walked slowly across the field, stopping every few paces to examine the ground. He knelt down and pressed his fingers into the soil, feeling its temperature and its moisture. He looked for places where water had pooled during the winter rains. Water pooling was bad. It meant the soil did not drain properly. It meant the seeds might rot before they could sprout. He made a mental note of these wet spots. He would need to plant around them, or perhaps dig small ditches to drain the water away. From the wheat field, Samuel walked west to the cornfield. This field was slightly smaller than the wheat field, approximately 20 acres. The soil here was good but not excellent. It was slightly sandier than the wheat field, which meant it drained faster but also dried out faster. Corn could tolerate sandy soil better than wheat could. That was why Samuel planted corn here. He walked across this field as he had walked across the first, stopping every few paces, kneeling, touching the soil, making mental notes. Then he walked to the oat field, 15 acres of land, sloping gently toward the south. The oats did not need the best soil. Oats were hardy. They would grow almost anywhere as long as there was enough water. Samuel spent less time on this field. It was his least important crop. He would plant it last, harvest it last, and if something went wrong with the oats, his family would still eat. From the oat field, Samuel walked to the meadow. This was not a field for crops. This was a field for grass. Grass that would grow tall during the spring and summer, then be cut and dried into hay. The hay would feed his animals through the winter. The meadow was approximately 10 acres, located at the far western edge of the farm, where the land was too rocky for planting. Samuel walked across the meadow slowly, looking at the grass. It was still brown and dead from winter, but beneath the brown, he could see tiny green shoots beginning to emerge. The grass was waking up. It would be ready to cut in June. After 3 hours of walking and kneeling and touching soil, Samuel returned to the house. His legs ached from the walking. His knees were damp from kneeling on wet ground. His fingers were cold and stained brown with soil. He removed his boots at the kitchen door, setting them on a wooden board to dry. Martha was already in the kitchen. She had been awake for hours. The fire was burning in the stove. The coffee was boiling. The smell of cornmeal porridge filled the room. Samuel sat down at the oak table at his usual place, the chair closest to the stove. Martha placed a bowl of porridge in front of him. The porridge was made from cornmeal and milk, cooked slowly until it was thick and smooth. Steam rose from the bowl. Samuel picked up his spoon and began to eat. The porridge was warm and slightly sweet. Martha had added a small amount of molasses, as she did most mornings. Next to the bowl of porridge, Martha placed a hard biscuit from the previous day. The biscuit was dry and dense. It had been baked 2 days ago, and it had grown harder since then. But Samuel did not complain. He dipped the biscuit into his porridge to soften it, then ate it in small bites. After the porridge and the biscuit, Martha poured him a cup of coffee. The coffee was made by boiling water in a pot, then adding ground coffee beans. The beans had been roasted and ground at home, using a hand-cranked grinder that Martha turned every morning. She let the coffee steep for 5 minutes, then poured it through a cloth filter into Samuel's cup. The coffee was dark and bitter. Samuel added a small amount of sugar, stirring it slowly with his spoon. He drank the coffee in small sips, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He sat at the table for perhaps 20 minutes, eating and drinking in silence. Martha did not speak. The children were still asleep. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire in the stove and the occasional rattle of a window pane in the wind. When Samuel finished his coffee, he stood up from the table. He put on his boots again. He walked out the kitchen door and across the barnyard to begin his morning chores. The animals needed to be fed. The eggs needed to be collected. The day's work was just beginning. Samuel sat down at the oak table at his usual place, the chair closest to the stove. Martha placed a bowl of porridge in front of him. The porridge was made from cornmeal and milk, cooked slowly until it was thick and smooth. Steam rose from the bowl. Samuel picked up his spoon and began to eat. The porridge was warm and slightly sweet. Martha had added a small amount of molasses, as she did most mornings. Next to the bowl of porridge, Martha placed a hard biscuit from the previous day. The biscuit was dry and dense. It had been baked 2 days ago, and it had grown harder since then. But Samuel did not complain. He dipped the biscuit into his porridge to soften it, then ate it in small bites. After the porridge and the biscuit, Martha poured him a cup of coffee. The coffee was made by boiling water in a pot, then adding ground coffee beans. The beans had been roasted and ground at home, using a hand-cranked grinder that Martha turned every morning. She let the coffee steep for 5 minutes, then poured it through a cloth filter into Samuel's cup. The coffee was dark and bitter. Samuel added a small amount of sugar, stirring it slowly with his spoon. He drank the coffee in small sips, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He sat at the table for perhaps 20 minutes, eating and drinking in silence. Martha did not speak. The children were still asleep. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire in the stove and the occasional rattle of a window pane in the wind. When Samuel finished his coffee, he stood up from the table. He put on his boots again. He walked out the kitchen door and across the barnyard to begin his morning chores. The animals needed to be fed. The eggs needed to be collected. The day's work was just beginning. Repairing farm equipment. By the 3rd week of March, the ground was still too frozen for planting. Samuel used this time to repair his farm equipment. He spent several days in the barn, examining each tool carefully, looking for cracks or weaknesses. The wooden plow was his most important tool. Without the plow, he could not prepare the soil. Without prepared soil, he could not plant. Without planting, there would be no harvest. The plow was made primarily of wood, with an iron blade attached to the bottom. The wooden parts were oak, strong and dense. The iron blade was called a plowshare. Samuel examined the plow carefully, running his hands along the wooden beam, feeling for cracks. He found a small crack near the handle, where the wood had begun to split along the grain. The crack was not large, perhaps 2 inches long, but it would grow larger if he ignored it. Samuel took out his knife. It was a simple folding knife with a wooden handle and a steel blade. He had owned this knife for 20 years. He had sharpened it so many times that the blade was noticeably narrower than it had been when he bought it. He opened the knife and began to whittle the cracked area of the plow handle. He removed thin shavings of wood, working slowly and carefully, smoothing the rough edges of the crack. Then he took a small piece of leather and wrapped it around the cracked area, tying it tightly with twine. The leather would hold the wood together. It was not a permanent repair, but it would last through the spring planting. After fixing the plow, Samuel examined the harnesses. The harnesses were leather straps that connected the oxen to the plow or wagon. The leather became stiff and brittle over time, especially after being exposed to rain and snow and sweat. Samuel checked each strap carefully, pulling on them, bending them, looking for cracks. He found a small crack in one of the straps that connected to Buck's yoke. The crack was not severe, but it would worsen. Samuel took a small pot of tallow from a shelf in the barn. Tallow was rendered animal fat, hard and white at room temperature. He rubbed the tallow into the cracked strap, working it into the leather with his fingers. The tallow would soften the leather and prevent further cracking. It was a temporary solution. Eventually, the strap would need to be replaced, but it would last through the spring. After examining the harnesses, Samuel turned his attention to the chains. The chains were made of iron, each link hand-forged by a blacksmith. They were used to connect the plow to the yoke or to pull logs out of the woodlet. Samuel examined each link, looking for rust or weakness. Most of the links were in good condition. A few had surface rust, which Samuel scraped off with a file. None of the links were cracked or broken. On the fourth day of repairs, Samuel decided to visit the blacksmith in town. He needed to have some metal parts repaired or replaced. He harnessed Jack, his horse, to the wagon. The wagon was wooden with iron-rimmed wheels. It was old but sturdy. Samuel drove the wagon slowly down the dirt road that led from his farm to Millbrook. The road was muddy from the melting snow. The wheels sank into the mud, leaving deep ruts behind him. The journey took nearly an hour. Samuel passed several other farms along the way. He saw smoke rising from chimneys. He saw men working in barns, repairing equipment just as he was. He saw children playing in muddy yards. He waved to a neighbor, a man named Jacob Wilson who lived 2 miles to the north. Jacob waved back. No words were exchanged. There was no need. Millbrook was small, as Samuel had known it his entire life. He drove the wagon down the main street, past the general store and the church and the post office. He stopped in front of the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop was a wooden building, larger than most of the houses in town. It had a wide doorway open to the air and a roof that sloped down from front to back. Inside, Samuel could see the glow of the forge. He climbed down from the wagon and walked inside. The heat hit him immediately. The forge was a large brick structure, shaped like a fireplace, with a fire burning in the center. A bellows attached to the side of the forge pumped air into the fire, making it burn hotter. The blacksmith's name was Henry Clark. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and strong, with forearms that were thick and scarred from years of working with hot metal. He was hammering a piece of iron on his anvil when Samuel entered. The anvil was a heavy block of iron, shaped like a flattened pyramid, mounted on a wooden stump. Henry struck the iron with his hammer, again and again, shaping it into a horseshoe. The sound was loud and rhythmic. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike of the hammer sent sparks flying. Henry looked up when he saw Samuel. He stopped hammering and set down the horseshoe. "Morning, Samuel," he said. "Morning, Henry," Samuel replied. Samuel placed his metal parts on the workbench near the forge. There was a plowshare that had become worn thin from years of cutting through soil. There were several iron bolts that had snapped in half. There was a chain link that had stretched and weakened. Henry examined each piece carefully, holding them up to the light, running his thumb along the edges. "Plowshare can be sharpened," he said. "Bolts can be replaced. Chain link can be reforged." "How much?" Samuel asked. Henry thought for a moment. $3. $3 was a significant amount of money, but Samuel knew he had no choice. Without these repairs, his equipment would fail during planting. $3, Samuel agreed. Henry nodded. He placed the metal parts near the forge and began to work. Samuel watched for a while, fascinated as always by the transformation of iron under heat and hammer. Henry heated the plowshare in the forge until it glowed red. Then he placed it on the anvil and struck it with his hammer, flattening the edge, making it sharp again. Sparks flew with each strike. The smell of hot metal filled the shop. When the repairs were complete, Samuel paid Henry $3 from the small leather pouch he carried in his pocket. He loaded the repaired parts into his wagon and drove home. The sun was beginning to set as he turned onto his own road. The sky was orange and pink. The air was cooling rapidly. Samuel unloaded the metal parts and stored them in the barn. He would attach them to the plow and chains tomorrow. For now he walked to the house, where Martha had supper waiting. The day's work was done. Late March, preparing the fields. By the last week of March, the ground had thawed enough to begin plowing. Samuel rose early on the first day of plowing, before the sun had even begun to lighten the eastern sky. He dressed in the dark, as always. He walked to the barn and lit a lantern. The lantern was made of tin, with small holes punched in the sides to let the light out. Inside, a candle burned. The light was dim, but it was enough to see by. Samuel led Buck and Star, his 2 oxen, out of their stalls. The oxen were slow and sleepy, blinking in the lantern light. Samuel attached the yoke to their shoulders. The yoke was a heavy wooden beam, shaped to fit across the necks of both oxen. It was connected to the plow by chains. Samuel led the oxen out of the barn and across the barnyard to the wheat field. The sky was beginning to lighten now, turning from black to deep blue. The stars were fading. A rooster crowed in the distance. Samuel positioned the oxen at the edge of the field. He lifted the plow, placing the blade into the soil. The plow was heavy. It was designed to cut through the earth, turning it over as it moved forward. Samuel took hold of the plow handles. "Get up," he said to the oxen. The oxen began to walk. Slowly, steadily, they pulled the plow forward. The blade cut into the soil, turning it over in a long, continuous ribbon. The soil was dark and rich, smelling of earth and minerals and the promise of growth. Samuel walked behind the plow, holding the handle steady, guiding the blade through the earth. The work was physical and repetitive. He walked the same straight line from one end of the field to the other. Then he turned the oxen around and walked back in the opposite direction. Then he turned again, and again, and again. Each pass of the plow turned over a strip of soil approximately 1 foot wide. To plow a single acre, Samuel had to walk nearly 8 miles. To plow all 40 acres of his wheat field, he would walk more than 300 miles. The work took weeks. Day after day, Samuel rose before dawn. Day after day, he led the oxen to the field. Day after day, he walked behind the plow, turning the soil, preparing it for planting. His legs ached constantly. His hands, even with leather gloves, developed blisters that broke and reformed and broke again. His shoulders and back were sore every evening. But he did not stop. He could not stop. The planting season was short. If he did not prepare the soil now, he would not be able to plant on time. If he did not plant on time, the crops would not mature before the first frost. If the crops did not mature, his family would go hungry. So Samuel walked, step after step, furrow after furrow, field after field. By the end of March, he had plowed approximately 15 acres of the wheat field. The rest would have to wait until April. But the work was progressing. The soil was being turned. The field was being prepared. And spring was only just beginning. April, planting season. Early April, preparing seeds. April arrived with warmer temperatures and longer days. The remaining snow had melted completely. The ground was soft and ready. Samuel turned his attention from plowing to seed preparation. He walked to the barn and climbed the ladder to the hayloft. In the corner of the loft, away from the hay, were several large cloth bags. These bags contained the seeds from the previous year's harvest. Samuel had saved them carefully, knowing that this year's crop depended on last year's seeds. He carried the bags down the ladder and spread them on the threshing floor. He opened the first bag, which contained wheat seeds. The seeds were small, brown, and hard. Samuel poured a handful into a bucket of water. Some of the seeds floated to the surface. Some sank to the bottom. The floating seeds were bad. They were too light, too dry, too damaged to germinate properly. The sinking seeds were good. They would sprout when planted. Samuel spent the morning testing seeds. He tested the wheat first, then the corn, then the oats. He discarded the floating seeds, saving only those that sank. The process was tedious. He handled hundreds of seeds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. His fingers became stained and sore. His eyes grew tired from watching the seeds float or sink. But he continued, hour after hour, until all the seeds had been tested. Martha helped him in the afternoon. She sat on a wooden stool near the barn door, where the light was best. She poured seeds into a bucket of water, waited for them to separate, then scooped out the floating ones with a small strainer. The good seeds she spread on cloths to dry. The bad seeds she threw into a pile for the chickens. Together, Samuel and Martha tested seeds for 3 days. By the end of the third day, they had approximately 40 bushels of good wheat seed, 20 bushels of good corn seed, and 15 bushels of good oat seed. Samuel divided the seeds into cloth bags, each bag containing enough seed for 1 acre of planting. He labeled the bags with charcoal on cloth: wheat, corn, oats. Then he stored the bags in the barn, ready for planting. Mid-April, the first plantings. The wheat field was fully plowed by the second week of April. Samuel began planting on a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear. The temperature was cool but not cold. A light breeze blew from the west, carrying the smell of damp earth. Samuel filled a cloth bag with wheat seeds and slung it over his shoulder. The bag was heavy, perhaps 30 pounds. He walked to the edge of the wheat field and began to scatter the seeds. This process was called broadcasting. Samuel reached into the bag with his right hand, grabbed a handful of seeds, and flung them across the soil in a wide, even arc. He took a step forward. He grabbed another handful. He flung them. Step, grab, fling. Step, grab, fling. The motion was rhythmic and repetitive. Samuel's arm moved back and forth, scattering seeds across the prepared soil. The seeds fell like rain, tapping softly against the ground. Samuel walked the length of the field, broadcasting seeds as he went. When he reached the end of the field, he turned and walked back in the opposite direction. He did this again and again, covering the field row by row. The work required concentration. If he scattered the seeds too thickly, the plants would be crowded and would not grow well. If he scattered them too thinly, he would waste valuable land. He had to find the right balance, spreading the seeds evenly across the soil. He had been doing this for decades. His body knew the motion. His arm knew how much seed to grab. His wrist knew how to flick the seeds in a wide arc. He did not have to think about it. He simply walked and scattered and walked and scattered. By the end of the first day, Samuel had planted approximately 2 acres of wheat. By the end of the second day, he had planted another 2 acres. By the end of the first week, he had planted nearly 15 acres. The wheat field was half finished. He would complete it by the end of the month. Late April, planting corn. Planting corn was different from planting wheat. Corn required individual placement, not broadcasting. Each seed had to be planted in its own hole, at the proper depth and spacing. Samuel used a digging stick to create the holes. The digging stick was exactly what it sounded like. A wooden stick, approximately 3 feet long, with one end sharpened to a point. Samuel walked to the cornfield with William, his 17-year-old son. William carried a bag of corn seeds. Samuel carried the digging stick. They worked side by side, Samuel making the holes and William dropping the seeds. Samuel pushed the digging stick into the soil, twisting it slightly to create a hole approximately 2 inches deep. He pulled the stick out. William dropped 2 or 3 seeds into the hole. Samuel covered the hole with soil using his boot. Then they took a step forward and did it again. Step, dig, drop, cover. Step, dig, drop, cover. The work was slow, much slower than broadcasting wheat. Samuel and William could plant approximately 1 acre of corn per day, working from dawn until dusk. Their backs ached from bending over. Their fingers were sore from handling seeds. Their boots were caked with mud. They spoke very little as they worked. Samuel would say, "Here," indicating where the next hole should go. William would say, "Done," indicating that the seeds had been dropped. That was the extent of their conversation. They did not need to talk. They had worked together for so many years that words were unnecessary. The rhythm of the work was its own language. The cornfield was 20 acres. At 1 acre per day, it would take Samuel and William 3 weeks to plant all the corn. They worked every day, rain or shine. On rainy days, they wore coats made of oiled canvas to keep dry. The rain made the soil soft and easy to dig, but it also made their hands cold and slippery. On sunny days, they removed their coats and worked in their shirt sleeves. The sun felt warm on their backs. The work was hard, but it was not unpleasant. By the end of April, they had planted approximately 10 acres of corn. The remaining 10 acres would be planted in early May. Late April, planting vegetables. While Samuel and William planted corn, Martha planted the vegetable garden. She had been planning the garden for months, thinking about which vegetables to plant and where to put them. The garden was her domain. Samuel did not interfere. Martha began with the potatoes. Potatoes were not grown from seeds. They were grown from pieces of potato, each piece containing at least one eye from which the new plant would sprout. Martha had saved potatoes from the previous year's harvest for this purpose. She cut the potatoes into small pieces, each piece about the size of an egg, with 1 or 2 eyes. She carried the pieces to the garden in a wooden bucket. Using a hoe, she dug shallow trenches in the soil, approximately 6 inches deep. She placed the potato pieces in the trenches, spacing them about 12 inches apart. Then she covered them with soil. The potatoes would take several weeks to sprout. They would be ready to harvest in late summer. After the potatoes, Martha planted beans. Beans were easy. She simply pushed each bean seed into the soil, about an inch deep, and covered it over. She planted beans in rows, spacing the seeds about 4 inches apart. She planted approximately 200 bean seeds, enough to feed her family through the summer and provide dried beans for winter. After the beans, Martha planted carrots. Carrot seeds were tiny, almost like dust. She sprinkled them carefully along shallow furrows, trying to distribute them evenly. It was impossible to get them perfectly spaced. She would have to thin the seedlings later, pulling out the extra plants so the remaining carrots had room to grow. After the carrots, Martha planted turnips and parsnips. These root vegetables were similar to carrots in their planting requirements. She made shallow furrows, sprinkled the seeds, and covered them with soil. Turnips and parsnips would be harvested in the fall and stored in the root cellar for winter eating. After the turnips and parsnips, Martha planted cabbage. Cabbage seeds were larger than carrot seeds but still small. She planted them in small groups, 3 or 4 seeds per group, spacing the groups about 18 inches apart. When the seedlings appeared, she would thin each group to the strongest plant. After the cabbage, Martha planted onions. Onions were grown from small bulbs called sets. Martha pushed each onion set into the soil, leaving the tip exposed above the surface. She planted them in rows, spacing them about 4 inches apart. After the onions, Martha planted squash. Squash seeds were large and flat. She planted them in hills, which were small mounds of soil about 6 inches high. Each hill received 3 or 4 seeds. The hills were spaced approximately 4 feet apart, because squash plants grew large and needed room to spread. The vegetable garden was approximately 30 by 40 feet, which was 1,200 square feet. By the time Martha had planted potatoes, beans, carrots, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, onions, and squash, the garden was nearly full. She left a small section empty for late-season planting of greens and radishes. The planting took several days. Martha worked alone, except when Elizabeth helped her in the afternoons. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. Her knees ached from kneeling. Her hands were sore from handling seeds and soil, but she did not complain. This was her work, and she took pride in it. May growth and maintenance. Early May, watching for germination. The first week of May was cool and rainy. Samuel welcomed the rain. The newly planted seeds needed moisture to germinate. Without rain, they would sit in the dry soil and rot. With rain, they would swell and split and send tiny roots downward and tiny shoots upward. Samuel walked through his fields every morning, checking for signs of growth. He walked slowly, looking closely at the soil. First, he saw nothing. The fields looked the same as they had the day after planting. Brown soil, no green. But on the 5th day of May, he saw the first wheat shoots. They were tiny, barely visible, like small green needles poking up through the soil. Samuel knelt down and touched one of the shoots. It was soft and delicate. He smiled. The wheat was growing. Over the next several days, more shoots appeared. The brown field slowly turned green as thousands of wheat plants emerged from the soil. By the end of the first week of May, the wheat field was covered in a thin layer of green. The corn was slower to germinate. Corn seeds needed warmer soil than wheat. The first week of May was still cool, and the corn seeds sat in the ground, waiting. Samuel checked the cornfield every day, but he saw nothing. On the 10th day of May, he saw the first corn shoots. They were thicker than wheat shoots, more substantial. They pushed up through the soil in small green spikes. Within a week, the cornfield was covered in young plants, each one a few inches tall. The vegetable garden germinated more quickly than the fields. Martha checked the garden every morning, and by the end of the first week of May, she saw bean shoots, carrot sprouts, and potato plants emerging from the soil. The cabbage seedlings appeared a few days later. The squash was slower, but by the middle of May, the squash hills were covered in large, flat leaves. Samuel continued to walk through his fields each morning. He watched the crops grow, measuring their progress with his eyes. He looked for signs of trouble: wilting, yellowing, spots on the leaves. He found none. The crops were healthy. The rain continued to fall on most days. The soil was moist but not waterlogged. The conditions were good. Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction as he walked through his fields. The planting was complete. The seeds had germinated. The crops were growing. Now he had to keep them growing. Mid-May, weeding begins. As the crops grew, so did the weeds. Weeds were unwanted plants that competed with the crops for water, sunlight, and nutrients. They grew faster than the crops. They were hardier. They would take over the fields if left unchecked. Samuel began weeding in the middle of May. He started in the wheat field, where the weeds were most numerous. The weeds were small, still young, but they were growing rapidly. Samuel walked slowly through the wheat field, bending down to pull each weed from the soil. He grabbed the weed at its base, close to the ground, and pulled firmly. The weed came out, roots and all. He tossed it into a basket he carried on his arm. When the basket was full, he carried it to the edge of the field and dumped it. The pulled weeds would dry in the sun and eventually become part of the soil. The work was tedious and physically demanding. Samuel's back ached from bending. His knees hurt from kneeling. His hands, even with gloves, became raw and sore. But he continued, hour after hour, day after day. He was not alone. William helped him in the wheat field, working alongside his father. Martha weeded the vegetable garden, which was smaller than the fields but required more careful attention. Elizabeth helped her mother in the garden. Even young Thomas tried to help, though his small hands could not pull the larger weeds, and he often pulled up crop plants by mistake. The weeding was never finished. For every weed Samuel pulled, dozens more seemed to appear. The weeds grew faster than the crops. They seemed to multiply overnight. Samuel would clear a section of the wheat field, only to return a week later and find it covered in weeds again. He would clear it again, and the weeds would return again. This was the nature of farming. The work was never done. There was no final day when Samuel could say, "The weeding is finished." The weeding continued throughout the growing season, from May until harvest. Late May, other maintenance tasks. In addition to weeding, Samuel spent the last week of May performing other maintenance tasks around the farm. The fences, as always, needed repair. Winter had weakened several sections of split-rail fencing. Posts had rotted. Rails had cracked. Animals had pushed against weak spots. Samuel walked the entire perimeter of his farm, inspecting each section of fence. He carried a hammer, a bag of nails, and a cart loaded with new rails. When he found a broken section, he stopped. He removed the old, broken rail. He measured a new rail against the gap. He cut the new rail to length with a handsaw. He positioned the new rail between the posts. He nailed it in place. Then he continued walking. The barn roof also needed attention. Several shingles had loosened during the winter winds. Samuel climbed a wooden ladder to the roof, carrying a bag of new shingles and a hammer. He removed the old, damaged shingles. He positioned new shingles in their place. He nailed them down. The work was slow and careful. One wrong step and Samuel could fall from the roof. He moved deliberately, testing each foot placement before shifting his weight. The chicken coop needed cleaning. Samuel removed all the old straw from the coop, forking it into a wheelbarrow. The old straw was dirty, mixed with chicken droppings and feathers. He wheeled it to the compost pile and dumped it. Then he spread fresh straw on the floor of the coop and in the nesting boxes. The chickens would appreciate the fresh bedding. They would lay more eggs when their coop was clean. None of these tasks took very long. A few hours for the fences. A few hours for the barn roof. A few hours for the chicken coop. But collectively they filled the days. Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, moving from one task to the next, never stopping, never resting for more than a few minutes at a time. By the end of May, the farm was ready for summer. The crops were growing. The weeds were being controlled. The fences were repaired. The barn roof was secure. The chicken coop was clean. Samuel looked out over his fields and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The hardest work was still ahead. Summer would bring heat and hay making and harvest. But for now, in late May, everything was in order. The farm was thriving, and Samuel was ready for whatever came next. Summer. June continued growth. Early June. The fields fill with green. The first day of June arrived with warm sunshine and a gentle breeze from the south. Samuel woke before dawn as always, dressed in the dark, and walked to the barn to feed the animals. The morning chores took approximately 2 hours. He fed the oxen and the horse, forking hay into their stalls from the loft above. He fed the pigs, carrying buckets of kitchen scraps and grain to the pig pen. He collected eggs from the chicken coop, reaching carefully under each hen to pull the warm eggs from the nesting boxes. He carried the eggs to the house in a woven basket, setting them on the kitchen counter where Martha would wash and store them. After the morning chores, Samuel sat down to breakfast. Martha had prepared cornmeal mush, which was similar to the porridge she served in winter but thicker, almost solid. She cut the mush into slices and fried them in a cast-iron skillet with a small amount of lard. The fried mush was crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Samuel ate 3 slices, along with 2 eggs from that morning's collection and a thick slice of salt pork. He drank 2 cups of coffee, dark and bitter with a small amount of sugar. After breakfast, Samuel walked to the wheat field. The wheat was now several inches tall, forming a green expanse across the 40 acres. The plants were thick and healthy, their leaves a deep green color. Samuel walked through the field slowly, looking at the wheat, touching the leaves, checking for signs of disease or insect damage. He found none. The wheat was thriving. From the wheat field, Samuel walked to the cornfield. The corn was slower to grow than the wheat, but it was visible now, standing several inches above the soil. The corn plants were stiff and upright, their leaves pointing toward the sky. Samuel walked between the rows, looking at each plant. Most were healthy. A few had been damaged by insects, their leaves chewed or torn. But the damage was minor. The corn would recover. Samuel spent the rest of the morning weeding. He worked in the wheat field first, pulling weeds from between the wheat plants. The weeds were larger now than they had been in May, with deeper roots and thicker stems. They were harder to pull. Samuel had to grip each weed firmly and pull with steady pressure, leaning back with his body weight. Some weeds broke off at the surface, leaving the roots in the ground. Those weeds would grow back within a week. Samuel tried to remove the entire plant, roots and all, but it was not always possible. The sun rose higher in the sky as Samuel worked. By mid-morning, the temperature had reached the high 70s. Samuel removed his wool coat and hung it on a fence post. He rolled up his sleeves. Sweat formed on his forehead and ran down his face. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. At noon, Martha walked to the field carrying a basket. The basket contained dinner: bread, cheese, pickled vegetables, and a jug of water. Samuel stopped working and sat down in the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the field. He ate slowly, taking small bites, chewing thoroughly. William joined him, sitting on the grass a few feet away. They did not speak. They simply ate and rested, listening to the birds and the wind in the trees. After dinner, Samuel rested for an hour. He lay on the grass in the shade, his hat over his face, and slept lightly. The sleep was not deep, but it was enough to restore his energy for the afternoon's work. At 1 o'clock, he stood up, put on his hat, and returned to the field. He worked until the sun began to set, around 7 in the evening. Then he walked back to the house, washed his hands and face at the well, and sat down to supper. The pattern was the same every day. Breakfast, work, dinner, rest, work, supper, sleep, repeat. Mid-June, hay-making begins. The meadow grass was tall enough to cut for hay by the second week of June. The grass had been growing since early spring, fed by rain and warm sunshine. It was now approximately 2 feet tall, thick and green. Samuel knew that he had to cut the grass at exactly the right time. If he cut it too early, the grass would be too wet and would not dry properly. If he cut it too late, the grass would become tough and woody, and the animals would not eat it. The right time was when the grass was tall but still tender, before it began to flower. Samuel and William began cutting the grass on a Tuesday morning. They used scythes, which were long, curved blades attached to wooden handles. The blade of a scythe was approximately 3 feet long, sharpened to a razor edge. The handle was approximately 5 feet long, with a grip in the middle and a second grip at the end. Samuel had used the same scythe for 15 years. He had sharpened it so many times that the blade was noticeably narrower than when he had bought it, but it still cut well. He had learned to sharpen it properly, using a small whetstone to hone the edge after every hour of use. The technique for using a scythe was specific. Samuel stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his body slightly twisted to the right. He held the handle with both hands, one hand near the middle grip and the other hand near the end grip. He swung the blade in a wide, sweeping arc, keeping the blade parallel to the ground. The blade sliced through the grass at the base, cutting it cleanly. The cut grass fell to the left, forming a neat row. Samuel took a step forward and swung again. Sweep, step, sweep, step, sweep, step. The motion was rhythmic and almost graceful. Samuel's body moved in a continuous loop. Twist, swing, step, twist, swing, step. The sweat ran down his face and soaked through his shirt. His arms ached. His back ached. His hands, even with gloves, developed blisters from gripping the wooden handle. But he did not stop. He could not stop. The hay had to be cut. William worked alongside his father, swinging his own scythe. William was younger and stronger than Samuel, but less experienced. His technique was not as smooth. His swings were sometimes too high, leaving stubble that would not regrow properly. Sometimes too low, digging into the soil and dulling the blade. Samuel did not correct him. William would learn through practice as Samuel had learned through practice. It took Samuel and William 4 days to cut the entire meadow. The meadow was approximately 10 acres, and each acre required hours of swinging the scythe. By the end of the 4th day, all the grass was cut and lying in rows across the meadow. The cut grass was still green and wet, full of moisture. Could not be stored yet. Wet hay would mold and rot in the barn. The grass had to dry first. Samuel left the grass in the meadow, spread out in rows, exposed to the sun and wind. The sun would evaporate the moisture. The wind would carry the moisture away. In a few days, the grass would be dry enough to gather. Every afternoon, Samuel and William walked through the meadow with pitchforks, turning the cut grass over. The grass on the bottom of each row was still damp, protected from the sun by the grass on top. Turning the grass exposed the damp underside to the air, helping it dry faster. The smell of drying hay was sweet and pleasant. It filled the air around the meadow carried by the wind. Samuel breathed it in deeply. The smell of hay was the smell of summer. It was the smell of work and satisfaction and preparation for winter. After a week of drying and turning, the hay was ready to gather. Late June, more hay and garden tending. The hay gathering began in the last week of June. Samuel and William walked through the meadow with pitchforks, gathering the dried hay into large piles. Each pile was approximately 4 feet tall and 6 feet wide, containing enough hay to fill half a wagon. They worked slowly, methodically, building the piles one forkful at a time. After the piles were built, Samuel brought the wagon into the meadow. The wagon was pulled by Buck and Star, the 2 oxen. The oxen moved slowly, as they always did, their wide hoofs pressing deep into the soft meadow soil. Samuel loaded the hay onto the wagon by hand, using his pitchfork to lift each pile onto the wagon bed. William stood on the wagon, arranging the hay to maximize space. They worked together in silence, the only sounds being the scrape of the pitchforks and the breathing of the oxen. When the wagon was full, Samuel drove it to the barn. He backed the wagon up to the barn doors, then climbed into the hayloft. William threw the hay up from the wagon, and Samuel caught it and stacked it in the loft. The hayloft slowly filled with dried grass, stacked from floor to ceiling. The hay would remain here until winter, when the animals would eat it. The garden was also producing heavily by late June. The beans were ready to pick, the peas were swelling in their pods, and the greens were tall and tender. Martha and Elizabeth spent several hours each day in the garden, picking vegetables and carrying them to the house. The kitchen became a workshop of preservation. Martha washed the vegetables in a large wooden tub filled with water from the well. She cut the beans into small pieces, removing the ends and any damaged sections. She shelled the peas, popping each pod open with her thumb and scraping the peas into a bowl. She chopped the greens into smaller pieces, discarding the tough stems. The preserving process was called canning, though no cans were involved. Martha used glass jars with metal lids. She packed the prepared vegetables into the jars, leaving an inch of space at the top. She boiled water on the stove and poured the boiling water over the vegetables, filling the jars to the top. She wiped the rims of the jars clean, then placed the lids on top and screwed the metal bands down tight. The jars were then placed in a large pot of boiling water on the stove. They boiled for an hour, sometimes longer, depending on the vegetable. The boiling killed any bacteria or mold spores inside the jars. As the jars cooled, the lids would seal tightly, creating a vacuum that would keep the vegetables safe to eat for months. The process made the house very hot. The stove burned all day, heating the kitchen to uncomfortable temperatures. Martha and Elizabeth worked in their sleeves, their faces flushed and damp with sweat. But they continued jar after jar, because the canned vegetables would feed the family through the winter. By the end of June, Martha had canned 40 jars of beans, 30 jars of peas, and 20 jars of greens. The shelves in the storage room were filling up. The work was repetitive and tedious, but it was necessary. Without preserved food, the family would have nothing to eat in January but salted meat and root vegetables. The canned goods added variety to the winter diet. They were worth the effort. July peak summer work. Early July hay harvest. The hay harvest continued through the first week of July. The meadow was large, and the hay had to be gathered in stages. Samuel and William worked from dawn until dusk, loading the wagon, driving to the barn, unloading, and returning to the meadow for more. The days were long and hot. Temperatures reached the high 80s, sometimes the low 90s. The sun beat down on the meadow with no shade, no relief. Samuel wore a wide-brimmed hat to protect his face and neck, but his arms and the back of his hands became sunburned despite his long sleeves. He drank water constantly, walking to the well several times each day to refill his jug. The hay dust was thick in the air. It got into Samuel's nose and throat, making him cough. It settled on his skin, making him itch. He wiped his face with his sleeve, but the sleeve was covered in dust too, so it did not help. By the end of the first week of July, all the hay had been gathered and stored in the barn. The hayloft was full, packed tightly with dried grass. The animals would have enough to eat through the winter, assuming the winter was not unusually long or severe. Samuel stood in the barn and looked up at the hay. It was a good harvest. Not the best he had ever had, but better than some. He felt a quiet satisfaction. The hay was done. Mid-July, continued weeding and garden maintenance. With the hay finished, Samuel returned to weeding. The weeds had not stopped growing while he was busy with the hay. They had grown taller and thicker, their roots reaching deeper into the soil. Samuel walked through the cornfield, pulling weeds as he went. The corn was now knee-high, its stalks thick and strong. The leaves were broad and green, rustling in the wind. Between the corn plants, the weeds flourished. Samuel pulled them one by one, tossing them into the rows where they would dry and die. The wheat was beginning to turn golden at the top. The lower parts of the plants were still green, but the heads of grain were ripening, changing from green to yellow to gold. Samuel watched the wheat closely. He checked it every morning, looking for signs that it was ready to harvest. The wheat was not ready yet. It needed another 2 or 3 weeks. Samuel continued weeding the cornfield and the wheat field. He worked alone most days, because William was helping a neighbor with his hay harvest. The work was solitary and quiet. Samuel walked through the fields, bending and pulling, bending and pulling, hour after hour. His thoughts wandered as he worked. He thought about the weather and the crops. He thought about his children and whether they would stay on the farm or leave. He thought about his own father, who had farmed the same land before him. He thought about nothing at all, letting his mind go blank as his body performed the repetitive motions. In the third week of July, an unusual thing happened. An infestation of grasshoppers appeared in the wheat field. They came suddenly, hundreds of them, then thousands. They were small and brown, with long legs and wings that buzzed when they flew. They landed on the wheat plants and began to eat the leaves. Samuel noticed the grasshoppers on a Tuesday morning. He walked through the wheat field and saw them everywhere, clinging to the plants, jumping from leaf to leaf. He estimated that there were at least 20 grasshoppers per square yard, maybe more. Samuel and William spent a full day trying to reduce the grasshopper population. They walked through the fields with sticks, striking at the grasshoppers, trying to kill them. Each strike killed a few grasshoppers, but dozens more flew away, only to land again a few feet further down the row. The effort was only partially effective. Samuel knew that he could not eliminate all the grasshoppers. There were too many. He had to accept that some crop loss would occur. The grasshoppers would eat some of the wheat leaves. The wheat would produce slightly less grain. There was nothing Samuel could do about it. He continued weeding, ignoring the grasshoppers as best he could. Late July heat and maintenance. The last week of July was the hottest of the summer. Temperatures reached the mid-90s, and the humidity was high. The air felt thick and heavy, like a wet blanket. Breathing required effort. Moving required even more effort. Samuel adjusted his work schedule to avoid the worst heat. He woke at 3 in the morning, 2 hours earlier than usual. He worked in the fields from 4 until 8, when the sun was low and the temperatures were still tolerable. He rested from 8 until 4, staying in the house or in the shade of the barn. He returned to the fields at 4 and worked until 8, when the sun was low again and the temperatures were cooling. The rest period in the middle of the day was long. Samuel slept sometimes, lying on a blanket in the shade. Other times he sat in the kitchen with Martha, neither of them speaking, simply existing in the heat. Water became precious. Samuel drank from the well multiple times per day, lowering the bucket, pulling it up, and drinking directly from the bucket. The water was cool but not cold, the underground spring having warmed slightly after months of summer heat. The physical toll of the work was significant. Samuel's muscles ached constantly. His hands were covered in blisters and calluses. His back hurt when he bent over and hurt when he stood up straight. His sunburn peeled and reformed and peeled again. He was tired all the time, a deep exhaustion that sleep did not fully cure. But he continued working. The crops needed attention. The weeds needed pulling. The farm needed him. Martha brought water to the fields in the afternoons, walking from the house with a jug in each hand. She did not speak when she arrived. She simply set the jugs down and walked back to the house. Samuel drank, then continued working. The days blurred together. Each day was like the one before it and the one after it. Wake, work, rest, work, eat, sleep, repeat. July ended as it had begun, with heat and weeds and the slow, steady work of keeping the farm alive. August, late summer. Early August, continued crop monitoring. August arrived with slightly cooler temperatures. The heat was still present, but the worst of it had passed. The days were still long, but the sun was noticeably lower in the sky than it had been in June. Samuel could feel the change. His body, attuned to the seasons, sensed that summer was beginning to fade. The wheat was now golden and ready for harvest. The heads of grain were heavy and full, bending the stalks slightly. The leaves were turning yellow and brown, dying as the grain matured. Samuel walked through the wheat field and pulled a head of grain from a stalk. He rubbed it between his palms, separating the grain from the chaff. The grain was plump and hard. It was ready. The corn was tall now, higher than Samuel's head. The stalks were thick and green, with long, broad leaves that rustled in the wind. Ears of corn were forming on the stalks, each ear wrapped in green husks. Samuel pulled back the husk on one ear and looked at the kernels. They were small and soft, not yet mature. The corn needed several more weeks. The vegetable garden was producing steadily. Beans, peas, cucumbers, and summer squash were ready to pick every day. Tomatoes, which Martha had planted in a small section of the garden, were beginning to turn red. Martha and Elizabeth spent most of their waking hours picking, washing, and preserving vegetables. The kitchen was hot and humid from the constant boiling of water and jars. The shelves in the storage room were now full of canned goods. There were beans and peas and greens and tomatoes and cucumbers pickled in brine. There were jams made from berries that Martha had picked from the edges of the woodlet. There were jars of applesauce from the previous fall, still sealed and safe to eat. The storage room was a testament to Martha's labor. She looked at the shelves sometimes, counting the jars, calculating whether she had enough to last through winter. She thought she did, but she would keep preserving until the garden stopped producing. Mid-August, wheat harvest begins. The wheat harvest began on the second week of August. Samuel woke at 3 in the morning, earlier than usual, to take advantage of the cool morning air. He dressed quickly and walked to the barn. The wheat harvest required a different tool than the hay harvest. Instead of a scythe, Samuel used a cradle scythe. A cradle scythe was similar to a regular scythe, but with a wooden frame attached above the blade. The frame, called the cradle, consisted of several wooden fingers that curved forward from the blade. When Samuel swung the cradle scythe, the blade cut the wheat stalks, and the cradle caught the cut stalks, laying them in neat bunches on the ground. The cradle scythe was heavier than a regular scythe, and swinging it required more strength. Samuel lifted the tool, positioned himself at the edge of the wheat field, and began to swing. Sweep, step. The blade cut through the wheat stalks. The cradle caught them. The cut stalks fell to the ground in a neat bunch. Sweep, step, sweep, step. The motion was similar to hay cutting, but slower because the cradle added weight and resistance. Samuel's arms and back ached by the end of the first hour. By the end of the second hour, his hands were cramping from gripping the handle. By the end of the third hour, he was exhausted. But he continued. He could not stop. The wheat was ready, and it would not wait. William worked alongside his father, swinging his own cradle scythe. They worked in parallel rows, moving across the field together. The cut wheat lay behind them in rows, the bunches stacked neatly on top of each other. The work was so physically demanding that they had to rest frequently. Every hour they stopped for 10 minutes. They sat on the ground in the shade of the uncut wheat and drank water from their jugs. They did not speak. They were too tired to speak. The wheat field was 40 acres. At the rate Samuel and William could work, it would take approximately 2 weeks to cut all the wheat. They worked every day, rain or shine. On rainy days, the wheat was wet and harder to cut. The blade became dull more quickly, and the wet stalks stuck together, clogging the cradle. On sunny days, the wheat was dry and easy to cut, but the heat was oppressive. There was no perfect weather for harvest. There was only weather and work and the slow progress across the field. Hired help was sometimes available. Other farmers in the area finished their wheat harvest at different times, depending on when they had planted and how their fields were situated. If a neighbor finished his harvest before Samuel, he might come to help for a day or two. Samuel would pay him a small amount of money, or feed him, or promise to help him with his own harvest next year. In the second week of August, 2 neighbors came to help, Jacob Wilson and his son Thomas. They worked alongside Samuel and William for 3 days, cutting wheat from dawn until dusk. The extra hands made a significant difference. With 4 men working, they could cut nearly twice as much wheat in a day. By the end of the 3rd week of August, all the wheat had been cut. The field was covered in rows of cut wheat, the bunches lying on the stubble, drying in the sun. Late August, binding and stacking hay. After the wheat was cut, the bunches had to be bound into bundles. Binding meant tying each bunch tightly with twine so that it would hold together during handling and transport. Samuel and William walked through the field, gathering bunches of cut wheat. Each bunch was approximately 6 inches in diameter at the base. Samuel wrapped a piece of twine around the bunch, just below the heads of grain. He pulled the twine tight and tied a knot. The bound bundle was then stood upright in the field, leaning against other bundles for support. Groups of bundles were called shocks. Each shock contained approximately 20 to 30 bundles, arranged in a circle or a line. The bundles were placed with their heads up, so that any remaining moisture would drain down through the stalks and out the bottom. The shocks would remain in the field for 1 to 2 weeks, allowing the wheat to continue drying. The binding process was tedious. Each bundle had to be tied individually. There were thousands of bundles in the wheat field. Samuel and William worked for days, walking from bundle to bundle, tying and stacking. Their fingers became sore from handling the twine. Their backs ached from bending over. But they continued, because the wheat had to be bound before it could be transported to the barn. By the end of August, all the wheat had been bound and stacked in shocks. The field was covered in rows of shocks, each one a small pyramid of wheat bundles. The shocks stood in the field like soldiers, waiting for the next stage of the harvest. The wheat would remain in shocks until September, when Samuel would transport it to the barn and begin the threshing process. The summer was ending. The crops were being harvested. The work was far from finished. But the hardest days of summer were behind Samuel now. The heat would moderate, the days would shorten, and the farm would continue as it always did, through the turning of the seasons. Fall. September transition to fall. Early September, corn harvest and other crops. The first day of September arrived with cooler air and a feeling of change. The mornings were crisp now, with dew on the grass and a chill that required a coat until the sun rose higher. Samuel noticed that the sun was rising later each day and setting earlier. The long days of summer were over. The corn was ready to harvest. Samuel walked through the corn field on the morning of September 2nd, pulling back the husks on several ears to check the kernels. The kernels were plump and hard, yellow and dented slightly at the top. This was the sign of mature corn. The corn was ready. The corn harvest was different from the wheat harvest. Corn did not need to be cut with a scythe or cradle. The ears of corn grew on the stalks, and the ears were what Samuel wanted. The stalks themselves would be left in the field, to be plowed under in the spring or used as animal feed. Samuel and William walked through the corn field, pulling ears off the stalks. Each ear was wrapped in green husks. Samuel grabbed the ear near its base, twisted it sharply, and pulled. The ear came free from the stalk. He tossed it into a large basket that he carried on his arm. When the basket was full, he carried it to the wagon and dumped it. Then he returned to the field for more. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. The corn stalks were tall, higher than Samuel's head, and the ears were at different heights. Some were at waist level, easy to reach. Others were above Samuel's head, requiring him to pull the stalk down with one hand while twisting the ear with the other. The husks were rough and slightly sticky, leaving a residue on Samuel's hands that was difficult to wash off. The cornfield was 20 acres. At the rate Samuel and William could work, they could harvest approximately 1 to 2 acres per day. The corn harvest would take 2 to 3 weeks. While Samuel and William harvested corn, Martha and Elizabeth harvested the fall crops from the garden. The squash was ready, the pumpkins were orange and heavy, and the root vegetables were mature. Martha pulled the turnips and parsnips from the ground, brushing off the loose soil and cutting off the greens. She dug the potatoes with a garden fork, carefully lifting each plant to avoid spearing the potatoes beneath. She washed the potatoes in a tub of water, scrubbing off the dirt with a stiff brush. The root vegetables would be stored in the root cellar, a small underground room beneath the house that stayed cool but did not freeze. The temperature in the root cellar was perfect for storing potatoes, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions. The vegetables would remain fresh for months if stored properly. Martha arranged them on wooden shelves, each type of vegetable in its own section. The potatoes went on the bottom shelves, where it was coolest. The turnips and parsnips went above them. The onions hung in strings from the ceiling, their papery skins dry and rustling. The squash and pumpkins were stored in the barn, where the temperature was cool but not cold. They would keep for several months, providing fresh vegetables well into winter. By the end of the first week of September, the corn harvest was progressing well. Approximately 5 acres had been harvested, and the ears of corn were piled on the barn floor, waiting to be husked and dried. Mid-September, threshing wheat. The wheat shocks had been standing in the field for 2 weeks. The wheat was now fully dry, the stalks brittle and the grain hard. Samuel began transporting the shocks to the barn on the 2nd week of September. He drove the wagon through the wheat field, stopping beside each shock. William lifted the bundles from the shock and tossed them onto the wagon. When the wagon was full, Samuel drove it to the barn and unloaded the bundles onto the threshing floor. The threshing floor was the open area in the center of the barn, where the dirt had been packed hard by years of use. Samuel spread the wheat bundles across the threshing floor, opening the ties so that the stalks lay flat. The threshing process would separate the grain from the chaff. The traditional method, and the only method available to Samuel, was to beat the wheat with flails. A flail was a simple tool consisting of 2 sticks connected by a short length of leather. The longer stick was the handle, approximately 3 feet long. The shorter stick was the beater, approximately 2 feet long. The leather thong connected the 2 sticks, allowing the beater to swing freely. Samuel lifted the flail over his head and brought it down onto the wheat. The beater struck the stalks, knocking the grain loose from the heads. He swung again and again and again. The motion was similar to swinging a hammer, but with a longer arc. The flail struck the wheat with a solid thump. Grain scattered across the threshing floor. Dust rose from the beaten wheat, filling the air with fine particles that caught in Samuel's throat and made him cough. William worked alongside his father, swinging his own flail. They worked in rhythm, one swinging while the other raised his flail, then alternating. Thump, 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 thump. The sound echoed through the barn, rhythmic and steady. Threshing was slow work. Each bundle of wheat had to be beaten repeatedly to release all the grain. After beating, the stalks had to be turned over and beaten again. Then the stalks, now called straw, were removed with a pitchfork and set aside. The grain and chaff that remained on the threshing floor were then swept into a pile. The next step was winnowing. Winnowing separated the grain from the chaff. Samuel waited for a windy day, because winnowing required wind. On a day when the wind was blowing from the west at a steady pace, Samuel carried the pile of grain and chaff to the barn doors. He stood in the doorway, facing the wind, holding a shallow basket called a winnowing basket. He tossed the mixture of grain and chaff into the air. The wind caught the light chaff and carried it away, while the heavier grain fell back into the basket. He tossed again and again and again until the basket contained only clean grain. The winnowed grain was poured into cloth bags, each bag holding approximately 2 bushels. Samuel tied the bags closed and stacked them in the grain storage area of the barn. By the end of September, approximately half the wheat had been threshed and winnowed. The other half would be done in October. The threshing was tedious and slow, but it was necessary. Without threshing, the grain could not be separated from the chaff. Without separation, the grain could not be ground into flour. Without flour, there would be no bread. Late September, fall plowing. Some fields required plowing in the fall. The soil needed to be turned over before winter, to expose weed roots to the cold and to prepare the ground for spring planting. Samuel began fall plowing in the last week of September. He focused first on the fields that would be planted with wheat next spring. These fields needed to be plowed now, so that the winter cold could break down the soil clods and kill any wheat seeds near the surface. Samuel hitched Buck and Star to the plow, as he had done in the spring. He led them to the field that had grown corn that summer. The corn stalks were still standing, brown and dry. Samuel plowed them under, turning the stalks into the soil where they would decompose and add nutrients for next year's crop. The plowing was similar to spring plowing, but the conditions were different. The soil was drier in the fall, harder and more compacted. The plow blade had to cut through soil that had not been disturbed for months. The oxen strained against their yokes, their muscles bunching beneath their hides. Samuel walked behind the plow, holding the handle steady, guiding the blade through the earth. The work was slower than spring plowing and more exhausting. By the end of each day, Samuel's arms were trembling from the effort of controlling the plow. His legs ached from walking through the rough, uneven furrows. But he continued day after day because the plowing had to be done before the ground froze. In addition to plowing, Samuel planted cover crops in some fields. Cover crops were plants grown not for harvest but for the health of the soil. Clover and rye were common cover crops. They grew quickly in the fall, covering the soil and protecting it from erosion. In the spring, Samuel would plow the cover crops under, adding their organic matter to the soil. The cover crop planting was simple. Samuel broadcast the seeds over the prepared fields, just as he had broadcast the wheat seeds in the spring. He walked across the fields, scattering clover and rye seeds from a cloth bag. The seeds fell onto the soil, where they would germinate and grow in the cooling weather of autumn. The fall plowing and cover crop planting continued through the end of September. By the time October arrived, Samuel had plowed approximately half of the fields that needed plowing. The rest would be done in October, weather permitting. October peak harvest. Early October, continued fall harvest. The vegetable garden was still producing in early October, though the variety of vegetables was decreasing. The warm weather crops like beans and cucumbers had finished. The cool weather crops like kale and Brussels sprouts were still growing. Martha harvested the last of the tomatoes, pulling the green ones before the first frost could damage them. The green tomatoes would ripen slowly indoors, or be pickled for winter use. The potatoes were all dug and stored. The turnips and parsnips were all harvested. The carrots were pulled from the ground, their orange roots long and straight. Martha washed the carrots and cut off the greens, leaving an inch of stem attached to prevent the roots from drying out. She stored the carrots in the root cellar in boxes of damp sand, which kept them from shriveling. The squash and pumpkins were all harvested and stored in the barn. They sat on wooden shelves, their orange and yellow skins bright against the gray wood. Martha checked them regularly for signs of rot. A single rotting squash could spread its decay to the others if not removed quickly. The canning continued, though at a slower pace than in summer. Martha canned the last of the tomatoes, making sauce that would be used in soups and stews during winter. She pickled green beans and carrots, packing them into jars with vinegar, salt, and dill. She made relish from green tomatoes and onions, chopping the vegetables fine and cooking them with vinegar and spices before sealing them in jars. The house smelled of vinegar and dill and cooking vegetables. The kitchen was warm from the stove, even as the outdoor temperatures cooled. By the middle of October, the vegetable garden was nearly empty. Only the hardiest plants remained: kale, Brussels sprouts, and a few late-planted greens. These would continue to grow until the first hard frost killed them. Martha would harvest them before the frost, or cover them with cloth to extend the season. Mid-October, corn husking. The corn that had been harvested in September had been sitting on the barn floor, waiting to be husked. Husking meant removing the dried husks from the ears of corn and stripping the kernels from the cob. Samuel and William sat on wooden stools in the barn, surrounded by piles of corn. Each ear had to be handled individually. Samuel picked up an ear of corn. The husk was brown and dry, wrapped tightly around the ear. He pulled the husk back, stripping it away from the kernels. The silk, which had been soft and moist when the corn was growing, was now dry and brown. It came away with the husk, sticking to Samuel's fingers. When the husk was removed, Samuel rubbed the ear against a wooden peg that was mounted on a board. The peg was approximately 6 inches long, with a rough surface. Samuel held the ear in both hands and pressed it against the peg, twisting it back and forth. The kernels popped off the cob, falling into a large basket beneath the peg. When the ear was bare, Samuel tossed the cob into a pile for animal bedding or fuel. Then he picked up another ear and did it again. The work was tedious and repetitive. Samuel and William sat in the barn for hours, husking and stripping corn. Their hands became rough and chapped from handling the dry husks and kernels. Their fingers were stained yellow from the corn dust. The work was not physically demanding like plowing or haymaking, but it was monotonous. It required patience and attention to detail. A poorly stripped ear would still have kernels attached, which was wasteful. Samuel tried to strip each ear clean, leaving no kernels behind. The corn husking continued through the end of October. By the time it was finished, Samuel had filled dozens of bags with corn kernels. The bags were stacked in the grain storage area, next to the bags of wheat and oats. The corn would be used for animal feed, for grinding into cornmeal, and for trading with neighbors who needed corn. The cobs were piled in a corner of the barn, where they would dry further before being used as fuel in the stove or as bedding for the animals. Late October, slaughter and preservation of animals. The weather was cold enough by late October to slaughter pigs. Slaughtering was done when the temperature was low, because the meat needed to cool quickly to prevent spoilage. Samuel chose a day when the temperature was in the 40s, cold but not freezing. The pigs had been fattened through the summer and fall, eating corn and kitchen scraps and whatever they could forage in their pen. They were heavy and round, their hides thick with fat beneath the skin. Samuel selected the largest pig, a young boar that had been born in the spring. He did not name the pigs that were destined for slaughter. Naming them would make the work harder. The slaughtering process was skilled work. Samuel had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father. He knew exactly where to cut, how to bleed the animal, how to remove the internal organs without contaminating the meat. William helped, holding the animal steady while Samuel worked. The work was efficient and methodical. There was no cruelty in it, but there was no sentimentality either. The pig was an animal raised for meat, and now it was meat. After the pig was slaughtered, the butchery began. Samuel cut the carcass into portions: hams, shoulders, bacon, ribs, loin, and various smaller cuts. The hams and shoulders were salted and set aside to cure. The bacon was sliced thin and laid out on racks to be smoked. The ribs and loin were eaten fresh or frozen for later use. The remaining scraps were ground into sausage, mixed with salt, pepper, and sage, then stuffed into casings made from the pig's own intestines. Nothing was wasted. The fat was rendered into lard, which would be used for cooking and for making soap. The feet were pickled. The head was used to make head cheese, a type of sausage made from the meat of the skull. The organs were eaten fresh or dried for later use. The slaughtering and butchery took 2 days. When it was finished, Samuel had approximately 200 pounds of pork in various forms. The salted hams and shoulders hung in the smokehouse, a small wooden building behind the barn where a low fire burned continuously, filling the air with smoke. The smoking process would take several weeks, preserving the meat and giving it flavor. The sausage was packed in jars and covered with lard, which would keep it from spoiling. The fresh meat was eaten immediately or frozen in the cold weather. Samuel would slaughter another pig in late November, repeating the process. 2 pigs would provide enough meat for the family through the winter, with some left over to trade or sell. November, end of harvest and preparation for winter. Early November, final preparations. By the first week of November, all crops had been harvested and stored. The barn was full. The root cellar was full. The smokehouse was full. The storage room in the house was lined with jars of canned vegetables, pickles, relishes, jams, and sauces. The farm was ready for winter. Samuel spent the first week of November on final preparations. He walked through the house, checking for drafts and cracks. He stuffed rags into gaps around the windows and doors, blocking the cold air from entering. He checked the chimney, making sure it was clean and free of blockages. A blocked chimney could cause a fire, or worse, fill the house with smoke. He stacked firewood near the kitchen door, enough to last for several weeks. The wood was split and dried, stacked in neat rows against the house. The animals were given extra bedding to keep them warm through the coming cold. Samuel spread fresh straw in the animal stalls, thick layers that would insulate the animals from the frozen ground. He checked the chicken coop and pig pen, reinforcing any weak spots in the fences or walls. He repaired the roof of the pig shelter, replacing several shingles that had come loose. The water troughs were cleaned and refilled. Samuel knew that water would freeze in the coming months, so he would need to break the ice each morning and carry warm water from the house to the animals. It was extra work, but it was necessary. The animals could not survive without water. Mid-November, reflection on the year. On a quiet day in the middle of November, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a piece of charcoal. He was calculating the yields from the year's harvest. The wheat had produced approximately 25 bushels per acre. With 40 acres of wheat, that was 1,000 bushels total. Each bushel of wheat weighed approximately 60 pounds, so Samuel had harvested 60,000 pounds of wheat. Some of the wheat would be ground into flour for the family's bread. Some would be sold or traded for goods the family could not produce themselves. Some would be saved as seed for next year's planting. The corn had produced approximately 40 bushels per acre. With 20 acres of corn, that was 800 bushels total. Each bushel of corn weighed approximately 56 pounds. So Samuel had harvested nearly 45,000 pounds of corn. Most of the corn would be fed to the animals. Some would be ground into cornmeal for the family's porridge and bread. Some would be sold. The oats had produced approximately 30 bushels per acre. With 15 acres of oats, that was 450 bushels total. Each bushel of oats weighed approximately 32 pounds. So Samuel had harvested approximately 14,000 pounds of oats. The oats would be fed to the horse and the oxen. Samuel compared the yields to previous years. The wheat yield was average. The corn yield was slightly above average. The oat yield was slightly below average. Overall, the farm had been reasonably productive. The family would have enough to eat through the winter, with some surplus to sell or trade. Martha had calculated the quantity of preserved food in the storage room. She had 120 jars of canned vegetables, 40 jars of pickles and relishes, 30 jars of jams and jellies, and 20 jars of applesauce. She had 200 pounds of potatoes, 100 pounds of turnips, 50 pounds of carrots, 50 pounds of parsnips, and 20 pounds of onions. She had 40 pounds of dried beans and 20 pounds of dried peas. The food stores were adequate. The family would not go hungry. Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction as he looked at the numbers on his paper. The year's work had paid off. The harvest was in. The winter would be hard, as winters always were, but the family would survive. Late November, slowing down. As November ended, the pace of work slowed considerably. There was less outdoor work to be done. The fields were empty, plowed and waiting for spring. The animals were sheltered, their food stores laid in. The smokehouse held curing meat. The root cellar held vegetables. The barn held grain and hay. Samuel's days became shorter. He still woke before dawn, but there was less urgency in his movements. He fed the animals, collected the eggs, and returned to the house for breakfast. After breakfast, he worked on indoor tasks or barn-based tasks. He repaired tools that would be needed in the spring. He sharpened the blades of his scythe and cradle scythe, using a whetstone to hone the edges until they were razor-sharp. He mended harnesses and chains, replacing worn leather straps and broken links. He cleaned the barn, forking out the old straw and spreading fresh bedding for the animals. The work was steady but not rushed. Samuel worked at his own pace, taking breaks when he wanted, resting when he was tired. The pressure of the growing season was gone. The urgency of harvest was over. The days were cold and short, but they were also quiet. Samuel spent more time in the house in late November. He sat by the stove in the evenings, listening to the wind outside, watching the flames through the small glass window in the stove door. Martha sat nearby, knitting or mending clothes. Elizabeth read from the family Bible, sounding out the words slowly, improving her reading. William whittled small figures from pieces of wood, giving them to Thomas as toys. Thomas played with the wooden figures, making them walk across the kitchen floor, creating stories in his head. The family was together in the evenings now, in a way they had not been during the busy months of summer and fall. The work of the farm had brought them together during the day, but they had been too tired to talk, too focused on their tasks to interact. Now, in the quiet of late autumn, they sat together in the warm kitchen and existed in each other's company. They did not talk much. There was not much to say. But the silence was comfortable, not awkward. It was the silence of people who knew each other well, who had worked alongside each other for years, who did not need words to fill the space between them. The days grew shorter as November progressed. The sun rose later and set earlier. By the last week of November, the sun rose around 7 in the morning and set around 5 in the evening. The hours of daylight were few, and Samuel spent most of them indoors. He went to bed earlier now, often by 8 or 9 in the evening. There was no point in staying up. The candles were expensive, and there was nothing to do in the dark. He lay in bed beside Martha, listening to the wind and the occasional cry of an owl in the woodlet. He thought about the year that had passed and the year that was coming. He thought about his children and his wife and his farm. He thought about nothing at all, letting his mind drift into the darkness. Sleep came easily now, in a way it had not during the long, hot days of summer. The work was done. The harvest was in. The winter was coming, and Samuel was ready. December, early winter. Early December. Preparing for the holidays. December arrived with cold temperatures and gray skies. The first snow fell on the 3rd of December, a light dusting that covered the ground and coated the bare branches of the trees. The snow was not deep, perhaps an inch, but it signaled the arrival of winter. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Martha began preparing for Christmas in early December. The Thompson family did not celebrate elaborately. There were no large gatherings, no gifts exchanged beyond small handmade items. Christmas was primarily a religious observance, marked by attending church rather than by festivities at home. But Martha still made an effort to make the day special. She baked bread, as she did every week, but she also baked small pastries filled with dried apples and spiced with cinnamon. She baked a few small cakes, sweetened with molasses and studded with dried berries. The smell of baking filled the house, warm and sweet. Thomas was excited about Christmas. He was 6 years old enough to understand that Christmas was different from other days, young enough to still feel wonder. He asked his mother every day how many days remained until Christmas. Martha told him, and Thomas counted on his fingers, and then asked again the next day. Samuel had no gifts to give. The family did not exchange gifts in the way that modern families do. A gift might be a new pair of socks that Martha had knitted, or a small wooden toy that Samuel had carved. The value was not in the object but in the effort. The preparation for Christmas was not elaborate, but it was meaningful. The family would attend church on Christmas Day, then return home for a special meal. Martha would cook a ham from the smokehouse, roasted with apples and onions. There would be bread and butter and pickles and preserves. There would be the small cakes and pastries that Martha had baked. It would be a good day, a day of rest and gratitude. But it would also be a quiet day, like every other day on the farm. Mid-December, daily survival. The days in mid-December were very short. The sun rose around 7 in the morning and set around 5 in the evening. The hours of daylight were few, and Samuel did most of his outdoor work in the morning, when the light was brightest. The morning temperature was often below freezing. The water in the animal troughs was frozen solid, covered in a layer of ice that Samuel had to break with a hammer before the animals could drink. He carried buckets of warm water from the house to the barn, pouring it into the troughs to melt the remaining ice. The process took time. Each bucket held approximately 2 gallons of water. Samuel carried 2 buckets at a time, one in each hand, walking from the house to the barn and back again. He made several trips each morning, until all the troughs were filled with water that was not yet frozen. The animals had to be fed. Samuel forked hay from the loft into the animal stalls, dropping the dried grass down through the openings in the floor. The oxen and the horse ate steadily, their jaws moving in slow circles. The pigs received a mixture of corn and kitchen scraps, which Samuel carried to the pig pen in a large bucket. The chickens received scattered grain, which they pecked at eagerly from the frozen ground. The morning chores took 2 to 3 hours, depending on how cold it was and how quickly the water froze. After the chores, Samuel returned to the house for breakfast. Martha had porridge waiting, made from cornmeal and water, with a small amount of molasses for sweetness. She had coffee, hot and bitter. Samuel ate and drank slowly, warming himself by the stove. After breakfast, Samuel worked on indoor tasks. He mended clothes, stitching tears and patching worn areas with scraps of cloth. He repaired tools, replacing broken handles and sharpening dull blades. He cleaned the house, sweeping the floors and wiping down the counters. The work was not urgent. There was no deadline. Samuel worked at his own pace, taking breaks when he wanted. Martha focused on her own indoor tasks. She cooked and cleaned and mended and spun thread. Spinning was a winter task, done when there was no outdoor work to occupy her hands. She sat by the window in the sitting room, where the light was best, and worked the spinning wheel with her foot. The wheel turned, pulling wool fibers from her fingers and twisting them into thread. The thread would be used for knitting and weaving, making clothes and blankets for the family. Elizabeth helped her mother with the spinning, learning the rhythm of the wheel, the feel of the fibers between her fingers. She was 13 years old, nearly a woman, and she would need these skills when she had her own household. William worked in the barn, caring for the animals and maintaining the equipment. He was 17, strong and capable. Samuel trusted him to work alone now, without supervision. William spent hours in the barn, forking hay, cleaning stalls, checking the animals for signs of illness or injury. He was becoming a farmer, just as Samuel had known he would. Thomas was too young for real work. He spent his days playing with the wooden figures William had carved for him, or following his mother around the house, asking questions. "Why is the snow white, Mama? Where do the chickens go when it gets dark? Will it snow more tomorrow?" Martha answered when she could, but often she simply said nothing, and Thomas eventually grew quiet. The evenings were long and dark. After supper, the family sat by the stove, the only light coming from the fire and a single candle on the table. They did not talk much. There was nothing to say that had not already been said. Martha knitted. William whittled. Elizabeth read from the Bible, her lips moving silently as she sounded out the words. Thomas played with his wooden figures, making them walk across the floor, creating stories in his head. Samuel sat and watched the fire, his thoughts drifting. The day's work was done. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. The winter routine was monotonous, but Samuel did not mind. Monotony meant safety. Monotony meant survival. Monotony meant that the family was healthy and the farm was secure. He was grateful for the monotony. He went to bed early, around 8 or 9 o'clock. Martha joined him soon after. The candle was extinguished. The house was dark and quiet. The wind blew outside, rattling the window panes. Samuel closed his eyes and slept. Late December, monotonous days. The last week of December was cold and gray. The snow that had fallen earlier in the month had melted, then frozen, then melted again, leaving the ground a patchwork of ice and mud. Walking was difficult. Samuel slipped several times as he carried water to the barn, catching himself on fence posts to avoid falling. The pattern of each day was identical to the one before it. Samuel woke before dawn. He dressed in the dark. He walked to the barn. He broke the ice in the water troughs. He carried warm water from the house. He fed the animals. He collected the eggs. He returned to the house for breakfast. He worked on indoor tasks or barn tasks. He ate dinner at midday. He worked some more. He ate supper. He sat by the stove. He went to bed. The same vegetables from storage were eaten repeatedly. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, parsnips. Martha prepared them in different ways to add variety. Mashed, roasted, boiled, fried. But they were the same vegetables day after day, week after week. The diet included preserved meat from the smokehouse, ham, bacon, sausage. There was cheese from the cow that Samuel kept for milk. There was bread made from wheat flour, dense and hearty. There was dried fruit from the previous summer's harvest. Apples, pears, berries. The food was adequate. The family did not go hungry. But there was no variety, no novelty. Each meal was like the last. The weather remained cold. Some days brought snow, light flurries that dusted the ground and melted by afternoon. Some days brought freezing rain, coating the trees and fences in a layer of ice that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Some days were just gray and cold, with no precipitation, no wind, no change. On the coldest days, Samuel did no outdoor work at all. The animals could survive a day without fresh water, as long as they had snow to eat. Samuel stayed in the house, sitting by the stove, reading the Bible or simply staring at the walls. The monotony was oppressive to some, but not to Samuel. He had lived through 30 winters on this farm. He knew that the cold would not last forever. Spring would come. The snow would melt. The ground would soften. The work would begin again. Until then, he would wait. He would survive. He would endure. Christmas came and went. The family attended church on Christmas morning, bundling up in their warmest clothes and walking the quarter-mile to the small wooden church on the road to Millbrook. The church was cold, heated only by a small wood stove that did little to warm the space. The congregation sat on wooden benches, their breath visible in the air. The minister spoke about the birth of Christ, about hope and salvation and the promise of new life. Samuel listened, but his mind wandered. He thought about the fields waiting under the snow. He thought about the seeds stored in the barn. He thought about the spring still months away. After the service, the family walked home. Martha prepared the Christmas meal. Ham roasted with apples and onions, mashed potatoes, pickled beets, bread with butter, and the small cakes and pastries she had baked earlier in the month. The meal was good, better than their usual fare. Thomas ate 3 pieces of cake, his face smeared with crumbs. Martha did not scold him. It was Christmas. After the meal, the family sat by the stove. There were no gifts exchanged. There was no tree, no decorations. There was just the warm kitchen and the full bellies and the quiet companionship of people who had lived together for years. The day ended as every day ended. Samuel went to bed. Martha followed. The candle was extinguished. The house was dark and quiet. Christmas was over. Winter continued. Winter. January, deep winter. Early January. The routine continues. The first day of January 1848 arrived with a hard freeze. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and when Samuel woke before dawn, he could see his breath in the darkness of the bedroom. The windows were coated with frost on the inside, delicate crystals of ice that sparkled in the dim light from the embers in the stove below. Samuel rose from bed slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. He dressed in multiple layers. A wool undershirt, a cotton shirt, a wool coat, and over that a heavy canvas jacket that blocked the wind. He pulled on 2 pairs of socks and his leather boots. He wrapped a wool scarf around his neck and pulled a wool cap down over his ears. Even with all these layers, the cold bit at his face as soon as he opened the kitchen door. New Year's Day was not a celebration on Samuel's farm. There was no special meal, no time off from work, no gathering of neighbors. The animals still needed to be fed. The water still needed to be carried. The ice still needed to be broken. Samuel walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the frozen snow. The path from the house to the barn was well worn, a dark strip of packed snow and mud that stood out against the white of the surrounding ground. He had walked this path thousands of times, in every season, in every kind of weather. He could walk it with his eyes closed. The barn was cold, but not as cold as the outdoors. The animals generated heat, and the thick wooden walls held some of that heat inside. The air in the barn smelled of hay and manure and animal sweat. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was familiar. Samuel forked hay from the loft into the stalls below. The oxen and the horse moved toward the hay, their breath steaming in the cold air. He carried corn to the pig pen, scattering the kernels on the frozen ground. The pigs pushed their snouts through the snow, searching for the corn. He collected eggs from the chicken coop, reaching carefully under each hen. The eggs were cold when he picked them up, their shells almost too cold to hold without gloves. The hens had laid fewer eggs than usual. The short days and cold temperatures signaled to their bodies that it was not the season for laying. Samuel understood. Everything slowed down in winter. The animals, the plants, the work. He returned to the house with the eggs in a basket, setting them on the kitchen counter. Martha was already at the stove, cooking breakfast. The kitchen was warm, almost hot, from the fire. Samuel removed his outer layers, hanging his coat and scarf on hooks by the door. He sat down at the table. Breakfast was cornmeal mush, fried in lard until the outside was crispy and the inside was soft. There were 2 eggs from the morning's collection, fried in the same pan after the mush was removed. There was a thick slice of ham from the smokehouse warmed through. There was coffee, dark and bitter. Samuel ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food. He drank 2 cups of coffee, feeling the heat spread through his chest. After breakfast, Samuel worked in the barn. He forked fresh straw into the animal stalls, adding insulation against the cold. He checked the water troughs, breaking the ice that had formed since the morning. He carried more water from the house, making 2 trips with 2 buckets each. The animals drank deeply, their tongues curling around the cold water. Samuel spent the afternoon in the barn as well, repairing a broken harness. The leather strap had cracked during the fall plowing, and Samuel had been meaning to fix it for weeks. Now, with time to spare, he sat on a wooden stool near the barn door, where the light was best, and worked the leather with his hands. He cut a new piece of leather from a larger sheet using a sharp knife. He punched holes in the leather with an awl, a small pointed tool. He threaded leather cord through the holes, stitching the new piece to the old. The work was slow and meticulous. Samuel's fingers were stiff from the cold, even inside the barn, and he had to stop frequently to warm his hands in his armpits. But he continued because the harness needed to be ready for spring. When the repair was complete, Samuel tested the harness by pulling on it with his full strength. The leather held. The stitches did not break. The harness was ready. Samuel set it aside with the other repaired equipment and walked back to the house as the sun was setting. The sky was orange and pink, the colors reflecting off the snow. The temperature was dropping rapidly, falling below 0 as the light faded. Samuel hurried inside, closing the door quickly behind him to keep the cold out. Supper was simple. Potato soup made from root cellar potatoes, with a small amount of ham for flavor, bread and butter, pickled beets. Samuel ate without speaking. Martha ate without speaking. The children ate without speaking. There was nothing to say. The day had been like every other day. Tomorrow would be the same. After supper, the family sat by the stove. Martha knitted a pair of socks for William, whose feet had grown during the summer. Elizabeth spun wool into thread, the spinning wheel humming softly. William whittled a wooden spoon, carving the bowl of the spoon with a curved knife. Thomas played with his wooden figures, making them fight and then make peace and then fight again. Samuel sat and watched the fire. The day's work was done. The night was cold and dark. He went to bed at 8 o'clock, falling asleep almost immediately. Mid-January, indoor work and household maintenance. The second week of January brought more cold weather and a snowstorm that dumped 8 inches of snow on the farm. The snow drifted against the house, burying the lower half of the kitchen door. Samuel had to dig his way out with a shovel, throwing the snow to the side in large piles. The path to the barn was buried. He had to dig that too, working for an hour before he could reach the animals. The storm was a reminder that winter was not yet half over. There would be more snow, more cold, more days of digging and hauling and surviving. Samuel accepted this. He had no choice. With outdoor work limited by the snow and cold, Samuel focused on indoor tasks. He mended clothes, sitting by the kitchen window where the light was brightest. He patched the knees of William's trousers, which had worn thin from kneeling in the fields. He stitched a tear in Martha's apron, using small, even stitches that would hold through many washings. He darned socks, weaving new thread across the holes in the heels and toes. He repaired a wooden chair that had become wobbly, tightening the joints with glue made from boiled animal hides. He replaced a broken rung on another chair, cutting a new piece of wood to size and fitting it into the existing holes. The household repairs were endless. There was always something that needed fixing. A loose hinge on a cupboard door, a crack in a window pane, a leak in the roof that had opened up during the snowstorm. Samuel addressed each problem as it arose, working methodically through his mental list of tasks. He was not a carpenter or a mason or a glazier. He was a farmer. But on a farm, a man had to be everything. He had to know how to fix a roof and repair a harness and sharpen a blade and treat a sick animal and deliver a calf and pull a tooth and set a broken bone. There was no one else to do these things. The nearest doctor was 10 miles away. The nearest carpenter was in Millbrook, 8 miles away. The nearest blacksmith was also in Millbrook. If something broke on the farm, Samuel fixed it himself, or it stayed broken. Martha also focused on indoor work. She cooked and cleaned and spun and knitted and sewed and preserved. She made soap from animal fat and lye, a long and unpleasant process that filled the house with a harsh, chemical smell. She melted the fat in a large pot over the stove, then added the lye slowly, stirring constantly with a wooden paddle. The mixture thickened and turned brown. Martha poured it into wooden molds, where it would harden over several days. When the soap was hard, she cut it into bars and stored them in the storage room. The soap would last for months, used for washing clothes and dishes and bodies. Elizabeth helped her mother with the soap making, learning the process so that she could do it herself when she had her own household. The work was hard and unpleasant, but it was necessary. Cleanliness was not just about comfort. It was about health. Soap prevented disease. Soap saved lives. Martha knew this, and she taught it to her daughter. The days passed slowly. Each day was like the one before it. Wake, chores, breakfast, indoor work, dinner, more indoor work, supper, stove, bed. The monotony was broken only by small events. A neighbor stopping by to borrow a tool, a letter from Martha's sister in Pennsylvania, a sermon at church on Sunday. But even these events were rare. The snow made travel difficult. The cold made travel dangerous. Most days, the family saw no one but themselves. They talked little. There was not much to talk about. The news from the outside world reached them slowly, through letters and occasional conversations at church. They knew that there was a war with Mexico, though they did not fully understand why. They knew that the president was James Polk, though they had never seen him and likely never would. They knew that new states were being added to the Union, though the names of those states meant nothing to them. The world beyond the farm was distant and abstract. The farm was real. The farm was everything. Late January, the worst of winter. The last week of January was the coldest of the winter. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero on 3 consecutive nights. The snow that had fallen earlier in the month did not melt. It remained on the ground, hard and crusted, reflecting the weak sunlight during the day and radiating cold into the air at night. Samuel had never known winter to be easy, but this winter was harder than most. The cold seeped into the house through every crack and gap. The walls were thick, but they were not insulated. The windows were single-paned, offering little resistance to the cold. The stove burned constantly, consuming wood at a rate that worried Samuel. He had cut and split a large pile of wood in the fall, but the pile was shrinking faster than he had anticipated. If the cold continued, he might run out before spring. He could not let that happen. Without wood, the stove would go cold. Without the stove, the house would freeze. Without a warm house, the family could not survive. Samuel rationed the wood, burning smaller pieces and letting the fire die down at night. The house was colder than usual, but it was not freezing. The water in the bucket by the kitchen door had a thin layer of ice on top each morning, but the water in the larger containers remained liquid. The family slept under multiple blankets, wool and cotton and quilted layers that trapped their body heat. They wore their daytime clothes to bed, adding extra socks and caps. Thomas slept between his parents, sharing their warmth. The animal shelters had to be inspected carefully each day. The pigs were hardy, able to withstand cold better than most animals, but they still needed shelter from the wind. Samuel added extra straw to the pig shelter, piling it high against the walls. The chickens were more vulnerable. Their coop was small and not well insulated. Samuel hung a lantern in the coop at night, the small flame providing just enough heat to keep the temperature above freezing. The hens huddled together on their roosting bars, fluffing their feathers to trap warm air against their bodies. The oxen and the horse were the hardiest of all. They stood in their stalls, their large bodies generating heat that filled the barn. The barn was noticeably warmer than the house, despite having no stove. The animals' body heat, combined with the insulating effect of the hay and straw, kept the temperature above freezing most nights. Samuel checked on the animals several times each day, looking for signs of frostbite or illness. He found none. The animals were healthy, despite the cold. The walk from the house to the barn was difficult in late January. The snow was deep, up to Samuel's knees in some places. The path he had dug earlier in the month had filled in with drifting snow, and he had to dig it out again. He carried a shovel with him whenever he went to the barn, using it to clear the way. The work was exhausting. His legs ached from lifting his feet high to step through the snow. His arms ached from swinging the shovel. His face ached from the cold, the skin on his cheeks and nose turning red and then white and then red again. He worried about frostbite. He had seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite. He had seen men lose ears and noses. He wrapped his scarf around his face, leaving only a small gap for his eyes. He pulled his cap down as far as it would go. He protected his skin as best he could. The days were short and dark. The sun rose around 7:30 and set around 5. The hours of daylight were few, and Samuel spent most of them doing the bare minimum required to keep the farm functioning. He fed the animals. He watered the animals. He collected the eggs. He carried wood to the house. He dug paths through the snow. That was all. There was no energy for anything else. The cold drained his strength. The darkness drained his spirit. He went to bed early and slept fitfully, waking often to check that the fire had not gone out. By the end of January, the cold began to moderate. The temperature rose to the teens, then to the 20s. The wind died down. The sun felt slightly warmer on Samuel's face when he walked to the barn. The worst of winter was over, or so he hoped. February would still be cold, but it would not be as cold as January. The days would grow longer. The sun would rise earlier and set later. Spring was still months away, but the turn had begun. Samuel could feel it in his bones. February, late winter. Early February, preparation for spring. February arrived with a thaw. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in weeks, and the snow began to melt. Water dripped from the eaves of the house, falling in steady drops that pounded the ground below. The paths became muddy, then icy, then muddy again. Walking was treacherous. Samuel slipped and fell twice on the way to the barn, catching himself with his hands before he could hit the ground. His palms were bruised, but nothing was broken. The thaw did not last. After 3 days of warm weather, the temperature dropped again, and the melted snow froze into a layer of ice that covered everything. The ground was slick and dangerous. Samuel scattered ashes from the stove on the paths, creating traction for his boots. The animals were restless during the thaw. The warmer weather signaled to their bodies that spring was coming, even though it was not. The hens began laying more eggs. The pigs rooted through the mud in their pen, searching for grubs and worms. The oxen lowed more frequently, calling to each other across the barn. Samuel understood their restlessness. He felt it too. The days were growing longer. The sun was higher in the sky. The cold was still present, but it no longer felt permanent. Spring was coming. Not soon, but eventually. As February progressed, Samuel began to prepare for spring. He examined his seed stores, checking the bags of wheat, corn, and oats that he had saved from the previous year's harvest. The seeds were dry and hard. They had been stored properly, away from moisture and rodents. They were good. He would not need to purchase seeds this year. He examined his equipment, checking the plow and the harnesses and the chains that he had repaired during the winter. Everything was in order. The plow blade was sharp. The harnesses were strong. The chains were intact. He would not need to visit the blacksmith before planting. He walked through the fields, as much as the snow and ice would allow, looking at the land. The snow was still deep in most places, but he could see the shape of the fields beneath the white. He remembered which fields had grown which crops the previous year. He knew which fields needed to be rotated to different crops this year. Crop rotation was essential. Planting the same crop in the same field year after year depleted the soil, making it less productive. By rotating crops, Samuel allowed the soil to recover. This year, he would plant wheat where he had planted corn last year. He would plant corn where he had planted oats. He would plant oats where he had planted wheat. The meadow would remain meadow, as it always did. The rotation was simple but effective. Samuel had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father. The knowledge was old, passed down through generations, tested by time and experience. It worked. That was all Samuel needed to know. Mid-February, continuing the routine. The middle of February brought more winter weather. The thaw ended, and the cold returned. The snow did not melt. It remained on the ground, hard and crusted, reflecting the sunlight during the day and radiating cold at night. The routine of winter continued much as it had in January. Samuel woke before dawn. He dressed in multiple layers. He walked to the barn. He fed the animals. He watered the animals. He collected the eggs. He returned to the house for breakfast. He worked on indoor tasks or barn tasks. He ate dinner. He worked some more. He ate supper. He sat by the stove. He went to bed. The days were still short, but they were growing longer. Samuel noticed the change. The sun was rising a few minutes earlier each morning and setting a few minutes later each evening. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was real. By the middle of February, the sun rose around 6:30 and set around 6. There were nearly 12 hours of daylight now, though the low angle of the sun made the light weak and pale. The food stores were adequate. There was no concern about running out of food. The root cellar still held potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips. The storage room still held jars of canned vegetables and pickles and jams. The smokehouse still held hams and bacon and sausages. The barn still held grain and hay. The family would not go hungry. The family remained healthy, which was fortunate. Medical care was limited. The nearest doctor was 10 miles away, and his services were expensive. Samuel knew of families who had lost children to diseases that could have been treated by a modern doctor. He knew of women who had died in childbirth, of men who had died from infections after minor injuries. He was grateful that his family was healthy. He prayed that they would stay healthy. Martha had a cough that had lingered since December, but it was not serious. She coughed in the mornings and evenings, clearing her throat, then went about her work as usual. Samuel coughed too, from the dust in the barn and the smoke from the stove. The coughs were normal. Everyone coughed in winter. There was no need to worry. Late February, looking ahead. The last week of February brought the first hints of spring. The temperature rose above freezing again, and this time the thaw lasted. The snow began to melt in earnest, water running off the fields in small streams that gathered in the low spots and then froze again at night, only to melt again the next day. The ice on the paths became slushy, then muddy, then slushy again. Samuel's boots were constantly wet. He had only one pair of boots, and they were not waterproof. His feet were cold and damp all day, every day. But he did not complain. The thaw meant that spring was coming. He could endure wet feet for a few weeks. As February ended and March approached, Samuel's thoughts turned increasingly to spring. He thought about the planting. He thought about the fields. He thought about the work that lay ahead. The winter had been long and cold, but it was ending. The days were growing longer. The sun was growing warmer. The snow was melting. The ground was softening. Soon, very soon, he would walk through his fields again, testing the soil, planning the planting. Soon, he would repair his equipment and prepare his seeds. Soon, he would hitch the oxen to the plow and begin turning the earth. The work would be hard. It was always hard, but Samuel looked forward to it. He was tired of winter. He was tired of the cold and the dark and the monotony of indoor work. He wanted to be outside. He wanted to feel the sun on his face and the soil beneath his hands. He wanted to see the crops grow. He wanted to watch the wheat turn from green to gold. He wanted to harvest and thresh and store. He wanted the cycle to begin again. Martha also looked forward to spring. She was tired of the root vegetables, the same potatoes and turnips and carrots meal after meal. She wanted fresh vegetables from the garden. She wanted peas and beans and greens, picked fresh and eaten the same day. She wanted to plant seeds and watch them grow. She wanted to feel the warmth of the sun on her skin. She wanted to open the windows and let the fresh air into the house. The children looked forward to spring as well. William looked forward to working in the fields, to using his strength for something meaningful. Elizabeth looked forward to the garden, to the feel of soil between her fingers. Thomas looked forward to playing outside, to running through the grass, to catching frogs in the pond. The family was ready for spring. The winter had served its purpose. It had forced them to rest, to conserve their energy, to prepare for the coming year. But now the rest was over. Now it was time to work again. Samuel stood at the kitchen window on the last day of February, looking out at the fields. The snow was patchy now, white against the brown of the soil. The trees were still bare, but Samuel could see the buds on the branches, small and tight, waiting for the right moment to open. The birds were returning. He had heard a robin that morning, singing from the top of the oak tree at the edge of the field. The sound had lifted his heart. The cycle was beginning again. Samuel thought about the year ahead. He would plant the same crops in roughly the same places. He would weed and water and harvest. He would preserve and store and prepare. The work would be hard, and the days would be long, and his body would ache, and his hands would blister, and his back would hurt. But he would do it. He had always done it. He would always do it. This was his life. This was his purpose. He was a farmer. The land was his. The seasons were his. The work was his. And when he died, William would take his place. The farm would continue. The cycle would continue. The work would never be finished, and Samuel had never expected it to be. He turned from the window and walked to the barn to feed the animals. The day's work was waiting. Tomorrow would bring more work. And the day after that, and the day after that. Spring was coming. The cycle was beginning again. Samuel was ready. Part 6. Closing reflection. And so the year comes full circle. Samuel Thompson's life in 1847 was one of routine, hard work, and relative predictability. He did not travel far from his farm. The farthest he traveled in 12 months was the 8 miles to Millbrook and back, a journey he made perhaps a dozen times over the course of the year. He did not read extensively. The family owned only 3 books: the Bible, an almanac, and a small volume of hymns. He read the almanac most often, studying the weather predictions and planting recommendations. He read the Bible on Sundays, following along as the minister read from the pulpit. He did not read for pleasure, because pleasure was not something he expected from reading. Reading was for information or for worship, not for entertainment. He did not engage in much intellectual pursuit. He did not discuss politics or philosophy or art. He did not know the names of the poets or the philosophers or the scientists of his time. He did not care about them. His concerns were concrete: soil, seed, weather, animals, food, shelter, clothing. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that kept his family alive. His life was physical, repetitive, and tied completely to the rhythms of the seasons. In the spring he planted. In the summer he weeded and harvested hay. In the fall he harvested his crops and prepared for winter. In the winter he rested and repaired and waited. The pattern repeated itself year after year, with only minor variations. Some years brought more rain. Some years brought less. Some years the crops were abundant. Some years they were sparse. But the pattern remained the same. Samuel did not question this pattern. He did not wonder if there was something more, something beyond the farm and the fields and the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. He did not dream of traveling to the city or seeing the ocean or meeting important people. He did not imagine a different life for himself. This was the life he knew. This was the life his father had known. This was the life his son would know. It was enough. Yet his work was essential. Without farmers like Samuel producing the food that fed America, civilization as it existed could not continue. The cities of the East Coast, with their factories and shops and offices, depended on the labor of men like Samuel Thompson. The wheat that Samuel grew became flour that was shipped to Boston and New York and Philadelphia, where it was baked into bread that fed the growing population of the industrial cities. The corn that Samuel grew fed the pigs and cattle that became meat for the tables of the wealthy and the poor alike. The oats that Samuel grew fed the horses that pulled the carriages and the wagons and the plows of the nation. Samuel was not a famous man. No one would write a book about him. No one would erect a statue in his honor. He would die, and his grave would be marked by a simple stone, and within a generation, no one outside his family would remember his name. But the food he grew fed people. The land he tended remained productive. The work he did mattered. He took pride in his work, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet satisfaction of crops growing well, of food stored for the winter, of animals thriving under his care. When he walked through his fields in June and saw the wheat standing tall and green, he felt a sense of accomplishment. When he bit into a fresh ear of corn in August, the kernels sweet and juicy, he felt a sense of reward. When he sat by the stove in December, his belly full and his family healthy, he felt a sense of peace. These feelings were not intense. They did not overwhelm him. They were simply there, a low hum of satisfaction beneath the surface of his daily life. He did not talk about these feelings. He did not have the words for them, but he felt them, and they sustained him through the hard days, the cold days, the days when his body ached and his hands blistered and his spirit flagged. Samuel's children would likely face similar lives. William, who was 17 years old, showed every sign of becoming a farmer himself. He had the strength and the patience and the knowledge. He understood the soil and the animals and the seasons. He did not dream of leaving the farm. He had never expressed any interest in the city or the sea or any other life. The farm was his home. The farm would be his life. He would marry, probably within a few years, probably a farmer's daughter from a neighboring farm. He would bring her to live on the Thompson farm, or perhaps on a farm of his own if Samuel could spare the land. He would have children. He would teach them to farm. The cycle would continue. Elizabeth would likely marry a farmer's son and begin her own version of the same life. She would keep a garden and preserve vegetables and care for chickens and raise children. She would cook and clean and spin and sew. She would work from dawn until dusk, as her mother did, as her grandmother did. She would not complain about this work, because she would not see it as something to complain about. It would simply be her life, as natural and unavoidable as the rising of the sun. She would take pride in her garden, in her preserves, in her children. She would find satisfaction in the small accomplishments of each day. Thomas was only 6 years old. It was too early to know what kind of man he would become. He might become a farmer like his father and his brother. He might become something else, though Samuel could not imagine what that something else might be. There were not many options for a boy growing up on a farm in rural Ohio. He could farm, or he could work in town at the general store or the blacksmith shop or the mill. He could become a minister if he showed an aptitude for learning and a calling to the church. He could become a teacher if the school in Millbrook needed one. But these were all variations on the same theme. He would live in the same area among the same people doing the same kind of work. He would not travel far. He would not become rich or famous. He would live a quiet, ordinary life as his father had done, as his grandfather had done. This was the life of ordinary Americans in the 19th century. Not dramatic, not noteworthy, not the stuff of adventure stories or historical epics, but essential to the building and sustaining of the nation. The farmers of America in the 1800s did not see themselves as heroes. They did not think of themselves as building a nation. They were simply trying to survive, to feed their families, to make it through one more winter, one more planting season, one more harvest. They worked from dawn until dusk, day after day, year after year, asking for little more than a harvest sufficient to sustain their families through the winter. They did not complain because complaining would not change anything. They did not dream of a different life because this was the only life they knew. They endured. They persisted. They survived. The comfort we enjoy today, in many ways, rests on the labors of people like Samuel Thompson. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, the homes we live in, the cities we inhabit, all of these are built on the foundation of agriculture. Without farmers, there would be no food. Without food, there would be no civilization. The modern world, with all its technology and convenience and complexity, depends on the simple act of planting seeds in the ground and waiting for them to grow. We have forgotten this, most of us. We buy our food from stores and restaurants, wrapped in plastic and paper, with no connection to the land that produced it. We do not think about the farmers who grew our wheat and corn and vegetables. We do not think about the soil and the sun and the rain. We do not think about the seasons and the planting and the harvest. But the connection is still there, even if we do not see it. Every bite of food we take is a link to the land and to the people who work it. The cycle will begin again next spring, when Samuel plants his crops once more. He will walk through his fields in March, testing the soil, making his plans. He will repair his equipment and prepare his seeds. He will hitch the oxen to the plow and turn the earth. He will plant his wheat and his corn and his oats. He will weed and water and watch. He will harvest and thresh and store. He will slaughter and preserve and prepare. And then winter will come and he will rest, and then spring will come again and he will begin again. The work is never finished. Samuel has never expected it to be. This is simply the life he knows. This is the life his father knew before him. This is the life his son will know after him. The farm continues. The seasons turn. The work goes on. And with that, Samuel retires for the evening. The day's work is complete. The animals are fed. The water is carried. The fire is banked for the night. Martha is already in bed, her breathing slow and even. The children are asleep in their room. Thomas curled around his wooden figures. William stretched out with his feet hanging off the end of the bed. Elizabeth lying still and quiet with her hands folded on her chest. Samuel stands at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the darkness. The stars are bright tonight, scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a giant hand. The moon is a thin crescent, casting pale light on the snow. The farm is quiet. The world is quiet. Samuel turns from the window and climbs the stairs to the bedroom. He removes his boots and his coat and his shirt and his trousers, folding them neatly on the chair in the corner. He slides into bed beside Martha, feeling the warmth of her body beneath the blankets. He closes his eyes. He listens to the sound of her breathing, the sound of the wind against the window, the sound of his own heartbeat slowing as sleep approaches. He thinks about tomorrow. He will wake before dawn. He will dress in the dark. He will walk to the barn. He will feed the animals. He will carry the water. He will break the ice. He will collect the eggs. He will eat his breakfast. He will work. He will eat his dinner. He will work some more. He will eat his supper. He will sit by the stove. He will go to bed. The same tasks, the same rhythm, the same life. He is ready for it. He has always been ready for it. He will be ready for it tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, for as many days as he is given. The farm needs him. His family needs him. The work needs him. He will not fail. He has never failed. He will not start now. Sleep comes, soft and dark, wrapping around him like a blanket. The fire in the stove burns low. The embers glow red. The house is warm. The farm is quiet. The night is deep. And Samuel Thompson, farmer of rural Ohio, sleeps the sleep of a man who has done his work and done it well. Tomorrow will bring more work, but that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only rest. If you have been listening to this story as you drift toward sleep, let it carry you the rest of the way. Let the slow rhythm of Samuel's days slow your breathing. Let the quiet of his farm quiet your mind. Let the simplicity of his life simplify yours, if only for a moment. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to prepare for. The work can wait. The world can wait. Sleep is here, soft and dark, waiting for you. Let go. Rest. Dream of fields and seasons and the turning of the earth. Dream of a life lived slowly, deliberately, one day at a time. And when you wake, the world will still be there. But for now, sleep.